hour where the world grows quiet and the dark grows louder. You're not alone. You're here tuned to a voice meant for sleepless hours, meant for wandering minds. Tonight, we step together into stories that do not rush, do not shout. They wait, they whisper, they press close when the lights are out. So lie back, let your breathing slow, and if something stirs in the corner of your room while I speak, don't look too quickly. Some things resent being seen. The butcher's hand. The rain had just begun to fall when Alex turned the corner of Chartres Street and caught the first whiff of smoke. It was subtle at first, curling in the humid night air, clinging to the wet bricks of the French Quarter. But then it grew stronger, sweet, charred, heavy with spices that seemed to cling to the back of his throat before he even saw the source. The restaurant had no sign, no awning, no bright neon to lure the late-night crowds. Just a narrow wooden door with peeling green paint, tucked between two shuttered antique shops. Yet outside that door stood a line of people, 12 exactly, silent, patient, waiting as though they all knew the same secret. Alex paused, the rain dripping from his umbrella, his critic's mind already awake. He had eaten in places where tables cost a fortune, where wine lists came bound in leather. But he knew, deep down, that the best meals were never in the guidebooks. They were hidden, whispered about, passed from mouth to mouth, never written down. And the smell, God, the smell. It was the kind that pulled memories you didn't know you had, of summer nights and charred meat and sweetness melting on your tongue. He stepped into the line without thinking. When the door opened, the man who stood there said nothing. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his apron black, with stains that had never been washed out. His hair was cut close, his eyes deep set, and his face bore the stillness of someone who had lived most of his life in heat and smoke. He let the first customer in, then the second. The line moved with the rhythm of ritual. When Alex's turn came, the man only glanced once at him and stepped aside. No menus, no words. Just a gesture toward one of the 12 small tables inside. The dining room was sparse, bare wooden walls, a single row of dim bulbs overhead. No music, no chatter, only the faint crackle of fire from behind a closed door at the far end. The smell that had lured him in was stronger here, thick enough to make his stomach tighten with anticipation. Plates were brought one by one, each holding the same thing. Ribs glistening under a lacquer of dark sauce, steam rising in slow curls. No sides, no bread, just ribs, placed with a reverence that made them feel less like food and more like an offering. Alex lifted one. The meat slid from the bone at his touch, tender in a way that only came from years of perfection. He bit, and his eyes closed before he could stop them. It was smoke and sweetness, yes, but also something else, something deeper, something that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm on his tongue, flavors that shouldn't have been possible. He chewed slowly, his critic's mind straining to name them, to categorize them, but no word matched. It was like trying to describe a dream after waking. And when he swallowed, a heat spread through his chest, not unpleasant, almost intimate. He ate silently, as all the others did. The man in the apron never spoke, never checked on them. He only moved from table to table, clearing bones, replacing plates, each gesture careful, almost ceremonial. By the time Alex reached the last rib, he was trembling. Not from fullness, there hadn't been enough for that, but from a hunger that grew sharper with every bite. He wanted more, needed more. When the man returned to clear his plate, Alex looked up, lips parted. "Could I?" The man shook his head before the words could leave him. His expression did not change, but his eyes hardened, and Alex felt the refusal settle heavier than words. Only 12 plates, only 12 portions, no more. The man carried the bones away, and the door behind the kitchen closed again. But the taste lingered, maddening, in Alex's mouth. That night, long after he had left the little restaurant, the flavor remained. It followed him back to his hotel, into his dreams, curling around him like smoke. He woke with the sensation still on his tongue, like the meal hadn't ended, like it was still inside him, waiting to be finished. And with that taste came something darker, a thought he could not dismiss. What was it? He had tasted pork from Iberia, Wagyu from Japan, lamb from New Zealand. He had trained his tongue to dissect notes of thyme, of star anise, of oak-smoked hickory, but this flavor escaped him. taunting him with its perfection. It was unlike anything he had eaten, unlike anything he could compare, and the more he failed to name it, the deeper his hunger grew. Alex woke the next morning with the taste still on his tongue. It was faint now, dulled by hours of sleep, but it lingered like smoke clinging to fabric after a fire. He brushed his teeth, drank bitter hotel coffee, tried to drown it with eggs from the cafe downstairs. Yet every bite felt pale, lifeless, hollow. His mind drifted back to the ribs, the heat, the sweetness, that impossible depth of flavor. The more he tried to push it away, the more it grew, a hunger curling deep in his chest. By evening, he found himself back on Chartres Street. The door with its peeling green paint looked the same as before, quiet, unremarkable, as though it could vanish at any moment if no one was looking. Already there was a line of 12, waiting in silence. He hesitated, then approached the tall man in the apron as he emerged to let them in. "I was here last night," Alex said. His voice sounded needy, thinner than he expected. "Could you just one more plate?" The man's expression didn't shift. He simply looked at Alex, his dark eyes unreadable, then shook his head once. The line moved. The door closed. Alex stood in the rain until the smell faded from the cracks of the wood, until his shirt clung to his skin and his stomach knotted with something that was no longer hunger but obsession. In the days that followed, he tried again. Each evening he returned, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, always with the same request. Each time the man refused. No words, no explanation, only the same unchanging ritual of 12 meals, never more. Alex began to ask around the quarter. Bartenders, cab drivers, the woman who sold pralines on the corner. Most gave vague answers, a shrug, a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. A few told him they had heard of the place, but none admitted to eating there. One man laughed and said, "You don't find it, it finds you." Another leaned close over a whiskey glass and whispered, "Don't press too hard. Some meals aren't meant for seconds." But Alex pressed anyway. He filled his notebook with theories, tried to reconstruct the flavors from memory, scribbled lists of spices and smokes and marinades, none of which came close. He paid attention to the customers who left the restaurant, searching their faces for clues. Most looked dazed, some euphoric, others pale, as if the meal had unsettled something deep within them. He dreamed at night of the ribs, dreamed of chewing endlessly, of gnawing bone until it splintered in his mouth. He woke with sweat cooling on his skin, throat aching with a hunger nothing could satisfy. One evening, frustrated beyond reason, he cornered an old woman in the quarter who was watching the restaurant from across the street. Her eyes were milky with age, but her voice was sharp. 12, she said before he could speak. Always 12. Not 13, not 11. He learned that the hard way. Alex asked what she meant, but the woman only smiled, showing teeth worn down to nubs. "Meat's not the same if you take too much. Goes bad, turns bitter." Her words echoed in him, though he could not make sense of them. He wanted to laugh, to dismiss her as another voice in the city's endless chorus of legends. But when the door opened again and the smell of smoke curled into the night, he felt his body lean toward it, helpless, as if her warning was less about superstition and more about truth he hadn't yet seen. Each refusal made him want it more. Each night deepened his obsession, and as the days passed, Alex no longer felt like a critic chasing a story. He felt like prey circling the edge of something vast and hidden, something that had already tasted him in return. The third week was when Alex stopped pretending to himself that this was simple curiosity. It was no longer about writing a review, no longer about chasing down a secret dish in a hidden corner of New Orleans. The flavor had rooted itself too deeply, threading through his veins, waking him in the middle of the night with the phantom sensation of meat sliding from bone against his tongue. He told himself he only wanted to know the recipe, to put words to the mystery, but words had never mattered less. What he wanted was the truth, the thing behind the smoke. That night the quarter was quiet, rain soaking the cobblestones until they gleamed under weak lamplight. He waited until the line had gone, until the 12 had eaten and left, their faces blank with the same dazed contentment he remembered. The door closed. The lights dimmed. Alex remained in the shadows, his heart thudding, waiting for the street to empty. When at last the hour grew late enough, he slipped across and tried the handle. Locked. He expected as much. He He circled to the back alley where the smell was stronger, clinging to the bricks, where grease and smoke seeped from vents high above. There, a service door stood flush with the wall, its paint cracked with age. He pressed gently and felt it give under his hand. The click of the latch sounded too loud in the still night, but no one came. Inside, the kitchen was darker than he had imagined. Not messy, not cluttered, but orderly in a way that felt unnatural, as though every knife, every pot, every spice jar had been set precisely where it belonged and never moved. The stove was cold, the counters clean. Only the faintest haze of smoke clung to the air, lingering like breath held too long. Alex's pulse quickened. He scanned the space, looking for a clue, a jar left open, a secret ingredient waiting to be found. But there was nothing, just silence and the memory of fire. Then he noticed it. At the far side of the room, half hidden beneath a shelf, was a trapdoor. Its wood was dark, stained deeper than the surrounding floorboards, and a brass ring glimmered faintly in the low light. He crouched, his hand hovering above it, and felt the draft seeping up through the thin cracks. The air was colder, damp, carrying with it the faint smell of earth and something sharper, metallic, that cut the back of his throat. He hesitated only long enough to hear his own breath. Then he slid his fingers into the ring and pulled. The trapdoor opened with a groan that seemed to echo far longer than it should, as though it disturbed something waiting below. A staircase led downward, narrow, steep, carved into the stone itself. Darkness pooled at the bottom like water in a well. Alex swallowed, the taste of those ribs suddenly alive again in his mouth, sharp and sweet and terrible. He set his foot on the first step, then another, and felt the cold rise to meet him, wrapping around his legs, his chest, his throat. By the time the trapdoor closed above him, shutting out the faint light of the kitchen, he knew there was no turning back. The only way left was down, and so he descended into the belly of the butcher's house, into the place where the flavor was born. The air thickened as Alex descended, each step drawing him deeper into the cold stone belly beneath the restaurant. The damp pressed against his skin, clinging to him like another layer of clothing, heavy and wet. The smell grew sharper with every footfall. It was not the smoke that had haunted him for weeks, not the sweet tang of sauce caramelizing over fire, but something rawer, more intimate iron and salt, the scent of blood long dried into stone. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a narrow passage. The walls wept with condensation, thin rivulets running down into grooves worn deep by years of dripping. His shoes scuffed against the floor, and the sound seemed swallowed too quickly, as though the dark itself devoured every echo. He gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam trembling, cutting only a narrow line through the air. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, until the passage widened into a chamber. The room was lit by a single bulb swaying from the ceiling, its filament glowing faint orange, barely alive. The light reached only part of the chamber, leaving the corners in thick shadow. And it was there, against the far wall, that Alex's breath caught. A man was chained upright, wrists bound in iron cuffs bolted into stone. His head drooped forward, chin on chest, hair matted to his temples. The body was skeletal, bones pressing against skin, ribs sharp as blades beneath parchment flesh. Every part of him looked consumed, wasted, hollow. Every part, except one, his left arm. It was grotesquely full, plump with flesh that seemed untouched by the starvation devouring the rest of him. The skin was taut, shining with sweat, the muscles firm, the fingers broad and strong. It looked out of place, obscene, like it belonged to another body entirely. Alex staggered closer without meaning to, the smell washing over him in waves. It was meat. Fresh, living, thrumming faintly with heat. His stomach twisted, not in disgust but in recognition, because he knew this smell. He had tasted it, weeks ago, lacquered in sauce, kissed by smoke. The ribs, the flavor that had broken him. The chained man stirred, a shudder running through his wasted frame. His head lifted slowly, and the bulb's faint light caught his face. Eyes sunken, lips cracked, but alive, still alive. He looked at Alex, and something passed through the air between them. Not a word, not even a thought, but the weight of unbearable suffering carried in silence. Alex's chest heaved, torn between horror and hunger. His critic's mind tried to deny it, tried to insist this was some grotesque trick, some theatrical cruelty staged for effect. But the smell in his nostrils told him otherwise. The taste on his tongue told him otherwise. The man's lips parted. No sound came at first, only a rasp of air. Then, with a voice raw from years of silence, he whispered, "Don't. Let him take the other." Alex's knees weakened. He took a step back, the flashlight beam skittering across the chamber, catching glimpses of hooks on the wall, of knives resting on a wooden block, blades darkened with stains that would never wash away. The bulb flickered, buzzing faintly, and in that faltering light, Alex felt the room tilt. The ribs, the flavor, the perfection he had chased. It was not pork, not beef, not anything the markets of the world could offer. It was here, chained to stone, carved piece by piece from a body still alive, preserved in a single limb left to flourish while the rest withered away. His stomach turned, his throat tightening with bile. But beneath it all, treacherous and undeniable, his mouth watered. The flavor had become part of him, and now he knew its source, and knowing was worse than never tasting at all. Alex stumbled backward, the beam of his flashlight stuttering across the stone floor. The chained man's words clung to him, fragile as cobwebs, but sharp enough to cut. He wanted to say something, to ask who he was, to promise help, but his throat had sealed shut. All that left him was a trembling breath that sounded like a sob. He turned and ran. The passage seemed longer now, the ceiling lower, the air thicker. His shoes slipped on damp stone, his hands scraped the wall, and the flashlight clattered from his grip, spinning wild beams until it struck the ground and died. He climbed the staircase in darkness, his body moving on panic alone, every muscle screaming for air. When he burst through the trapdoor into the silent kitchen, he slammed it shut and pressed his back to it, chest heaving, as though the floor itself might rise up and drag him back down. He fled the restaurant, out into the wet night, and didn't stop running until the quarter's streets blurred around him, until the rain washed the smoke from his skin. He left New Orleans the next morning without a word to anyone. No review was written, no notes were published. His hunger faded into nausea, and even the memory of flavor turned bitter in his mouth. For a time, he tried to forget. He ate bland food, plain food, bread and fruit and coffee, anything to remind himself of the world above ground. Yet sometimes, in the stillness before sleep, the taste returned, curling like smoke at the back of his throat, and with it came the memory of that arm, full and glistening, a feast preserved in living flesh. Weeks passed. His life began to regain its shape, though thinner, paler, as if the experience had carved something out of him. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived at his apartment door. No sender's name, no return address, just brown paper tied with twine, faintly greasy where the contents had seeped through. His hands shook as he carried it inside. The smell hit him before he opened it, unmistakable charred sweetness, smoke, the flavor that had ruined him. His stomach twisted with equal parts dread and longing. He unwrapped the paper slowly, his breath shallow. Inside was a parcel of ribs, still warm, the sauce clinging dark and glossy to the bone. Nestled atop it was a folded slip of paper, written in a hand he did not recognize. He read it once, then again. The words were simple. "It's a shame you couldn't wait for the perfect cut now that you know. You are part of the menu too." The room swayed around him. His hands trembled. He wanted to throw the package away, to burn it, to erase the scent that already filled every corner of his apartment. But instead, against his will, his gaze sank back to the ribs, the shine of the sauce, the steam rising in delicate curls, and beneath the horror in his chest, beneath the pounding of his heart, another sensation stirred something low, traitorous, impossible to silence. Hunga, the stranger in the elevator. The city outside the glass walls had long since gone to sleep, its towers fading into the night, their windows dark and scattered with only a few scattered points of light. The office, too, had given up on the day. Rows of cubicles stretched like a deserted grid, monitors pulsing faintly in sleep mode, chairs left askew, paper stacks untouched. The hum of servers behind locked doors was the only steady sound, a low vibration that seemed to settle in the bones of the building. Alex sat alone at his desk, shoulders bent, eyes stinging from hours staring into spreadsheets that no longer made sense. Numbers and cells blurred together until he could not tell whether he was correcting errors or making them. He had told himself he would leave at 9, then at 10, then at past. Now, it was nearly midnight. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent tubes above buzzed faintly, a tired kind of buzzing, as though they too had stayed far too long. He thought of his apartment, the silence waiting for him there, the comfort of a couch that sagged in the middle, the refrigerator humming like a faithful dog. For a moment he let himself imagine it, the dim glow of the streetlight through his blinds, the rhythm of rain against the glass if the weather turned. His body begged him to leave. And so, at last, he shut his laptop, slid it into his bag, gathered his things with hands that moved more slowly than he wanted. He checked his desk one last time, as though there were something there that could excuse another hour's delay. But the papers were mute, the numbers still wrong, and there was nothing left to do. The corridor to the elevators stretched long and sterile, a tunnel of carpet and glass that seemed more lifeless than it had in daylight. The motion-sensing lights above followed him reluctantly, switching off behind him, leaving the hallway darker with every step. Each time a light went out, he felt it more than saw it, the air thickening, the silence closing in, as though the building itself were sealing him in. He told himself not to be dramatic. It was only a late office, only another night, and he had walked this same hall hundreds of times. But tonight, with the floors empty and the air still, it felt different. It felt as though the place were waiting for him to leave, or waiting for him to stay. The elevator lobby was silent when he arrived, the brushed steel doors reflecting back only the faintest image of him. He pressed the call button, the sound of its click, sharp in the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened, and he thought of taking the stairs, though his legs ached from sitting too long. Then the familiar chime broke the silence, too loud, too hollow. The doors parted, and the car waited, empty and bright, a little box of mirrors and metal. He stepped inside. The door slid closed behind him with a soft hiss. The mirrored walls reflected him from every side. Pale face, sagging shoulders, a man half melted into fatigue. He stared at himself for a moment, tried to muster a smile, tried to look less hollow, but the image only stared back, unconvincing. He pressed the button for the basement garage. The light above the button glowed red. The car shivered once and began its descent. The numbers above the door counted down. 14, 13, 12. The hum of machinery was steady, familiar, the sound of a routine carried out exactly as it should be. Alex leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He thought of the steering wheel warm under his hands, the smooth roll of the tires on an empty street, the blessed quiet of his apartment. He thought he could almost hear it, almost feel the relief of the lock turning in his own front door. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and went out. The darkness was total. It came so suddenly that it felt like a blow, a pressure against his skin. The hum of the elevator died. The numbers above the door froze. His breath caught in his chest. He reached for the panel by instinct, fingers scraping over smooth steel, searching for the buttons he knew were there. He pressed them, and a blind panic door open. Close, lobby, basement, anything. No sound, no answering click, only the scrape of his fingers against metal. He pressed the red emergency button and held it, waiting for the line to crackle alive, for a voice to remind him this was a building, not a tomb. Nothing. Silence. He could hear his own breath now, ragged and uneven. The air felt closer, heavier, as though the walls had moved in while the light was gone. He pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. The screen burst alive, a small square of blue-white against the void, too bright for his eyes. He thumbed the flashlight icon. A narrow beam pierced the dark. The light swept across the cabin, over steel walls, over the panel, over the seam where the doors met, and over his own face, reflected back in the mirror, pale and startled. No one else. Nothing there. He let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half hysteria, and yet something felt wrong. The dark outside the beam felt occupied, like someone stood just at the edge, refusing to step closer. He listened. The silence swelled, thick with its own weight. "Hello," he whispered. His voice cracked, strange in the confined box. For a moment there was nothing. Then, softly, almost like a sigh, From the far corner of the car came a murmur. "It's too cramped." Alex froze. The words slid through the air like breath across the back of his neck. His heart pounded in his chest, rattling his ribs. He swung the beam to the corner. Empty. Only his reflection, pale and wide-eyed, the light quivering in his hand. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Who's there?" His voice was too loud this time, brittle, unconvincing. No answer. The silence closed back over him, thicker than before. The sound of his own breathing was unbearable, harsh and animal. His skin prickled, goose flesh rising along his arms. He pressed the buttons again, thumb slamming the panel. Door open, close, alarm. Every floor in sequence. Nothing. The elevator was dead, and yet he could not escape the thought the car was not empty. He pressed himself against the wall, phone light shaking in his hand, eyes darting to every shadow. The mirrored walls caught him from every angle, throwing back his fear, multiplying it. For one dreadful second he thought he saw his reflection move late, a fraction behind him, its mouth open in a shape his had not made. He turned his head quickly. Nothing. Only himself. But the words still lingered, echoing in the dark, as though the metal itself remembered them. "It's too cramped." His chest tightened. He shut his eyes, told himself he was tired, imagining things, stress carving voices into silence. He breathed slowly, forcing air into his lungs, forcing calm into his body. Then the elevator shuddered. The floor dropped half a foot and slammed back into place. He staggered, nearly dropping his phone, his heart seizing. The cables above groaned, rattling against unseen beams. The car swayed, a pendulum suspended in nothing. And then, close, right at his ear, another whisper slid through the dark. "It's too warm," Alex screamed, spinning, the beam flaring across steel. Empty. Only himself, pale and trembling. Only silence. The beam shook in his hand. His breath came ragged, sharp. His stomach turned. He could not think, could not breathe, could not bear the silence waiting for the next word. And yet he knew. He knew it was not done. The silence inside the stalled elevator grew unbearable, stretching long enough that Alex began to think he had been sealed into something deeper than a machine. His phone light trembled in his grip, throwing uncertain shadows across the mirrors, making it seem as if there were more than one of him in the cabin, each reflection whispering its own fear. He forced himself to breathe slower, pressing his back into the wall until the chill of the steel bled through his shirt, trying to believe that stillness meant safety. The car wasn't falling. That had to count for something. But the calm lasted only seconds before the entire box jerked. A violent jolt that slammed his shoulder into the door and sent the phone clattering out of his hand. The light spun crazily across the floor before settling at a skewed angle, the beam pointing into the seam where the doors met. Alex dropped to his knees and snatched the phone up, his breath rattling in his chest, and when he turned the beam back across the car, his reflection caught him again. He looked pale, trembling, desperate, and yet something in the reflection did not feel like him. Its mouth twitched in a grin when his lips were pressed tight. Its shoulders slouched forward as if leaning toward him. He blinked hard, shook his head, told himself it was exhaustion, nothing more. But the thought did not leave. The reflection was watching. The car groaned. The sound rose from above, cables dragging against steel pulleys, the high whine of strain. The elevator swayed, just slightly, but enough to set his stomach rolling. Alex pressed the buttons again, pressing each in turn, then pressing all of them at once, his thumb blistering against the dead panel. Nothing responded. He pressed the alarm until his skin hurt, but the silence pressed harder. He thought of shouting, pounding the walls, calling for help into the shaft, but the building was empty at this hour. No one was left to hear. Then, softly, as if answering the thought, the whisper came again. "No room left." The words slid through the seam of the doors. They were not loud, not sharp, but they were close. So close he could almost feel them brushing against his skin, brushing across his ear. He spun, pressed his forehead to the cold seam, shone the beam into the gap. For a moment he saw only black, the endless shaft beyond. Then, faint, reflecting the light back at him, were two eyes. They were wet, red at the edges as if swollen with tears, but unblinking, fixed directly on him. Alex jerked backward so hard he slammed into the rear wall, breath tearing out of his chest. His phone shook in his grip, the beam slashing wildly across the mirror, across the floor, across the ceiling. When it steadied again on the seam, the eyes were gone. The gap showed only emptiness, but the cold remained. A draft of air carrying a sour scent like damp cloth left too long in the dark. He pressed himself deeper into the corner, his knees pulled tight against his chest. He wanted to speak, to demand who was there, what it wanted, but the words tangled and would not leave his throat. His heartbeat filled the silence, the only rhythm left in the world. The elevator jolted again, harder this time, as though something heavy had dropped onto the roof. The ceiling panel rattled above him. His light caught the seam of the square, and for an instant he thought he saw fingers thin, gray, too long dragging across the metal. He whimpered, curling tighter. The scraping stopped. The silence returned. He whispered to himself over and over, "It isn't real. It isn't real. I'm tired. I'm just tired." But the car disagreed. The lights overhead flared suddenly, but not with the clean white he expected. They came alive in pulses of dim red, strobing faintly, buzzing as though choked with static. Each pulse lit the cabin differently. In one, his reflection grinned back at him with eyes too wide. In the next, the seam in the doors stretched wider, bending against pressure. In the next, something pale hunched in the far corner of the cabin, crouched low, staring. Then darkness again. He screamed, covering his eyes with his free hand. His phone nearly slipped from his other, the light jittering across the floor. He pulled his knees closer, pressed his forehead against them, begged himself not to look, not to open his eyes. But the whisper slithered closer, pressing against the shell of his ear, damp and steady. "Do you want to get out?" He snapped his head up. The words had not been imagined. They had shape. They had weight. He forced himself to look at the seam again, his hand trembling so hard the beam jittered. The gap had widened further. He had not heard the metal move, but now there was space enough for fingers, for a hand, for a face. And pressed against it was a cheek, pale and damp. The skin strained as if the bones beneath had softened to fit through the narrow opening. The eye came next, red, wet, locked on his. Alex gagged, bile rising in his throat. He stumbled sideways, pressing against the mirrored wall. His reflection leaned toward him, as though trying to press into his body. The cheek withdrew. The eye lingered for a long, unblinking moment. Then it, too, slid back into the dark. The seam closed. Alex stood shaking in the corner, tears burning at his eyes, the phone trembling until the beam wavered across his own pale face again. He wanted to believe it was over, that the whisper had finished with him, that the eye had gone forever, but the silence waiting in the cabin was not empty. It was patient, and when it came again, softer this time, from the walls themselves, there was no mistaking the words. "Come with me." The elevator no longer moved. Alex knew it in his bones, in the way the air settled heavy and unmoving, in the way the cables above ceased their restless groans. The car had stilled into a kind of waiting, as though the machine itself had decided the descent was finished. He stood pressed into the corner, phone light weak and trembling, every nerve screaming that stillness was not safety. Stillness was only a pause before something worse. The silence pressed on him, thick as water. He could not hear the city anymore, could not hear the hum of servers above or the whisper of air ducts. Only his own breathing, ragged and shallow, and the faint whir of the phone's light as though it, too, were straining to stay alive. Then from the seam of the doors came the sound again. A creak, soft, reluctant, metal bending against pressure. The gap widened, a finger's breadth. Then, too, the sound echoed through the cabin, scraping along his teeth, vibrating in his skull. Cold air seeped through, brushing his skin with the clammy touch of basements left undisturbed for years. It smelled of iron, damp hair, and something sour, as if breath had been trapped in the shaft for decades. Alex staggered forward, panic overcoming reason. He hooked his fingers into the seam, tried to wrench the doors wider, hoping, begging to see the concrete of the garage, the faint light of safety. But when he pulled, the gap revealed nothing of the sort. No wall, no cables, no counterweights, only blackness, bottomless and dense, a darkness that refused to reflect his light. And in that darkness, something shifted. He froze, his breath tearing in his chest, the light trembling in his grip. The whisper came again, curling through the crack like smoke. "Do you want to get out?" The words were wet. Each syllable dragged through a throat that had forgotten how to swallow. Alex's knees buckled. He pressed himself against the wall, foam beam locked on the opening, terrified of what might press through. The air thickened, his vision blurred with tears. He wanted to say no. He wanted to scream, but the word caught in his throat, unspoken. The gap yawned wider. Metal groaned, bolts strained, sparks spat in tiny bursts, and then something began to emerge. At first it looked like flesh pressed against glass, a pale cheek flattening against the narrow seam, skin bending in impossible ways. The bone beneath seemed to soften, reshaping itself to fit through. Slowly, painfully, the face squeezed into the car. Alex whimpered, shaking his head, whispering, "No, no, no, please." The temple came next, the edge of a brow, the stretched lid of an eye, and then the eye itself. It bulged red, swollen as though with endless weeping, yet unblinking, fixed directly on him. The pupil widened, shrinking and expanding in rhythm with his own ragged breath. The mouth followed, pressed tight at first, lips cracking at the corners from the strain, then opening wider, skin tearing faintly as the jaw unhinged. Teeth gleamed, wet and crooked. The breath that spilled from it was hot and foul, thick with rot. "Come with me." The words gusted into the cabin, carrying the scent of graves left unsealed. Alex screamed, stumbling sideways, his shoulder crashing into the mirrored wall, his reflection fractured in the cracked glass. Dozens of terrified Alexas staring back at him, each distorted, each smiling when he was not. The head pressed further in, stretching the seam, the metal shrieking in protest. The neck cord strained, the skin pulling taut, the impossible body forcing itself into a space too narrow to contain it. With each inch gained, the whisper repeated, "Come with me, come with me, come with me." Alex pressed his palms to his ears, trying to shut it out, but the sound did not fade. It was not in the air anymore. It was inside him, vibrating through his teeth, pulsing in his bones. His phone slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. The beam rolled, casting the light upward. For the first time, he saw the head fully inside, resting against the steel floor. No body followed, only the head, dragging itself forward, leaving no mark, no stain, as though weightless. It grinned at him, lips split wide. Its tongue twitched like a dying thing, struggling to form words. "Come with me." Alex collapsed into the corner, his hands trembling, his chest heaving so violently he thought his ribs might crack. He shut his eyes, whispering through clenched teeth, "Wake up, wake up. It isn't real. It isn't real." But when he opened them, the head was closer, only a foot away now, its wet mouth opening wider, wide enough to fit his own face. And in the mirror behind him, his reflection no longer cowered. It crouched beside the head, smiling, its lips moving in perfect unison with the whisper, "Come with me." The car trembled again, dropping an inch, then catching, as though the cables above were deciding whether or not to release. The sound of straining metal screamed in his ears. The walls groaned, bending inward slightly, narrowing the space. Alex clawed at the panel, slamming his fists against the dead buttons, pressing them until his hands bled. Nothing answered. The alarm remained mute. The car was no longer a machine. It was a throat, tightening, swallowing. The head inched forward, red eyes locked on him, teeth gleaming in the rolling light. "Come with me." The words pulsed louder, filling every corner, vibrating through the glass until the mirror itself seemed to hum. His reflection grinned wider, its eyes glowing faintly red now, its mouth stretched too far. Alex wept openly, rocking forward and back, whispering through sobs, "Please, no, please, not me." But the whisper did not negotiate. It only repeated, "Come with me." And with every repetition, the walls bent closer, the floor trembled harder, the space shrank smaller, until Alex understood that the car itself was obeying. The elevator wanted him to go. The cabin trembled around him like the ribs of a beast waking from long sleep, every seam straining, every bolt groaning as if the machine were no longer obeying its engineers, but something older, something buried in the dark. Alex pressed himself tighter into the corner, his breath shallow, his body curled against the cold steel, and yet there was nowhere left to go. The walls seemed closer than they had been moments ago, their mirrored surfaces bending inward, reflecting his terror from every angle, multiplying it until the cabin was crowded not with one frightened man but with a dozen, each pale, wide-eyed, each rocking in sync as though rehearsing a ritual. His phone lay face down on the floor where it had slipped from his trembling grip, its beam quivering against the ceiling, throwing the head into grotesque relief. The head had crossed the seam fully now. It rested inside the car, as though it had always belonged there. Its cheek flattened from the squeeze, its eyes swollen red and raw, its mouth twitching into a grin that never faltered. It did not move like a living thing. It did not drag itself forward in any way that made sense. It simply appeared closer each time the light flickered, its wet lips opening wider, its breath coating the steel walls in a film of rot. "Come with me," it whispered again, voice soft but soaked through with inevitability, as though the words had been spoken 1,000 times and would be spoken 1,000 more, no matter what he did. Alex clawed at the panel, pressing buttons blindly, his palms slick with blood where his skin had split against the unresponsive metal. He begged aloud now, words cracking like dry twigs. "Please, stop, please, I don't want to." But the plea dissolved in the hum that had begun to fill the car. The sound was low at first, a vibration in the soles of his feet, in the bones of his teeth, but it grew, spreading until it was not sound at all, but a living pressure, the sense that the elevator itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling around him, pulling the air from his lungs and replacing it with something else. The head edged closer, inch by inch, its jaw distended further, skin splitting at the corners, bloodless but raw, the opening wide enough now to take his face inside. Its eyes never blinked, never strayed, only fixed themselves on him with the patience of something that had no need to hurry. Alex pressed his palms to his ears, but the whisper was inside his skull now, reverberating against the inside of his head until he thought it might crack. "Come with me, come with me." The words did not stop, did not pause for air. They overlapped and folded, dozens of voices speaking in unison until it was a chant, until the steel beneath his body seemed to vibrate with the rhythm. The overhead lights burst one by one, glass pattering down like rain, leaving the cabin lit only by the faint, wrong glow of the head's eyes. They burned brighter with every syllable, pulsing in time with his frantic heartbeat. The car lurched downward, a violent drop that sent him sprawling onto the floor. He caught himself with his palms, the sting of raw skin tearing, and lay there gasping, the taste of iron in his mouth. The car stopped again, but not cleanly. It shuddered, sagged, hung as though suspended by a single thread. Above him the cables screamed, a metallic shriek that vibrated through the marrow of his bones. The head slid closer. It was only a foot away now, so near he could smell the damp rot of its mouth. Its whispers slowed, softened, became almost tender. "Come with me. There is no mourning. There is no leaving. Only this." Alex wept openly now, tears mixing with sweat, dripping onto the steel floor. He thought of his apartment, of the couch waiting in the dim light of the blinds, of the refrigerator's hum, of the small, simple comforts that had felt so certain only an hour ago. They seemed far away now, like memories borrowed from someone else's life. The only real thing was here, in this box, in this whisper, in these eyes. The walls bent inward further, mirrors warping until his reflection no longer looked like him. The figure staring back grinned with mouth stretched too far, eyes burning red to match the head. Their lips moved in time with the whisper, urging him forward, their movements lagging slightly, like marionettes tugged by a clumsy hand. He crawled backward, though there was no backward left to go. His spine pressed against the steel, his knees scraped raw on the floor. The head filled his vision now, its grin pulsed wider, its mouth opening in a silent roar, a void lined with crooked teeth, wide enough to consume. The elevator jerked again, but this time it did not drop. It squeezed. The floor tilted upward by degrees, slanting toward the open seam. The ceiling sagged closer to his scalp. The car was collapsing, folding itself inward, funneling him toward the waiting dark. Alex clutched the railing, screamed as the metal softened under his grip, bending like wax, sliding out of his hands. His reflection grinned wider, its jaw dropping until it unhinged, until the mouth was no longer a mouth but an opening that mirrored the head's. The chant swelled until the sound was no longer words but vibration, a living current pressing him toward the seam. The head leaned closer, so near its lips brushed his cheek, cold and wet, leaving behind a slick trail. Its voice was only for him now, quieter, like a secret. You already said yes. He shook his head violently, tears spraying, whispering through sobs. No, I didn't. I didn't. The whisper curled back. You came in. You pressed the button. You stayed. The elevator dropped another inch, just enough to rattle his bones, to remind him of the void waiting below. The head smiled wider, if such a thing were possible, its red eyes glowing so bright that they painted the cabin in sickly light. Alex thought he would break, thought his mind would shatter like the glass bulbs overhead. And yet beneath the terror, beneath the frantic struggle, something inside him began to soften. A thought, unbidden, a question. What if it was easier to stop fighting? What if the whisper was right? The car bent further, funneling him toward the crack. The head waited patiently, its mouth yawning open, the darkness behind its teeth blending with the void beyond the seam. His reflection nodded, urging him on, and for the first time, Alex leaned forward. The cabin had bent so far inward that Alex thought it would crush him flat, its walls groaning like ribs around a suffocating heart, the floor tilting, the ceiling pressing down against his scalp. The head hovered before him, mouth wide, the chant swelling until it was no longer words but a vibration that wrapped around his spine and pushed him toward the waiting dark. He leaned forward once, just enough to feel the breath of it against his lips, and then the world lurched. The car dropped again. It was not the slow, measured sway of cables straining, but a violent plunge, sudden and absolute, as though whatever had been holding him aloft had finally let go. His stomach tore upward into his throat. His scream caught and twisted into silence. The floor vanished beneath him. Then, as abruptly as it began, the fall stopped. The car slammed into stillness with a noise like bones breaking. Alex lay sprawled on the steel, the breath driven out of his lungs, ears ringing. For a moment he could not move, could not think, could only lie in the wreckage of his own body and wait for the whisper to return. The head was gone. The chant had cut away, leaving only the ringing in his skull. And then, with a long, mechanical sigh, the doors began to open. Light poured in, not the red glow of eyes, not the trembling flicker of dying bulbs. Fluorescent light, flat, steady, buzzing faintly, the ordinary illumination of a basement garage. Alex blinked hard, tears stinging his eyes, until the shape of the world resolved. Concrete pillars painted with stripes, yellow lines glistening with damp oil, the stale scent of dust and gasoline. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging himself toward the gap like a man escaping a grave. Figures stood just outside, men in reflective vests, hard hats tilted back, work gloves dangling at their sides. They had been talking among themselves, but when the doors groaned open, they froze, every head turning, every mouth falling silent, their eyes fixed on Alex with a mixture of confusion and fear, as though he had stepped out of a place no living man should come from. One of them moved first, a stocky man with a beard flecked with gray. His voice was rough, uncertain. "Where the hell did you come from?" Alex tried to answer, but his throat gave only a rasp, the word fractured by terror. He swallowed hard, forced sound through his raw chords. The elevator. I was stuck. The men exchanged glances. Another stepped forward, younger, his expression uneasy. "You've been in there?" Alex nodded, his head jerking too quickly. "Yes, it stopped. The lights went out. I pressed the alarm. I pressed everything, but no one came." His words tumbled out, frantic, unstoppable. "There was someone in there. I heard them. I saw." He choked on the rest, the memory too heavy to name. The first man shook his head slowly. "That's not possible." "Yes, it is," Alex snapped, his voice breaking high. "I was in there all night. I swear to God." But the man cut him off, his voice low, almost reverent. "That elevator hasn't run in years." The words struck harder than any fall. Alex stared at him, his lips moving but no sound emerging. The man went on. "They cut the power after the accident, 3 years ago. Man got stuck inside when the lights failed. By the time anyone found him..." He stopped, glanced at the others. No one finished the sentence. Alex shook his head violently, sweat flinging from his hair. No, no, you're wrong. I pressed the button. It opened. I saw the panel light up. I felt it move. His voice cracked again. I heard it. The younger man muttered under his breath, almost to himself. Doors were welded at the lobby. Nobody should have been able to get in. The silence that followed was worse than denial. Their pitying stares hollowed him out. Alex staggered forward, one foot out onto the concrete, then another, as if the air outside might convince him of its reality. But behind him, the elevator doors remained open, gaping into the car that had not changed at all. Only now he could see what he had not before. Dust thick along the edges, cobwebs sagging in the corners, the control panel hanging loose, wires dangling like veins torn open. The mirror was cracked from corner to corner, splintering his reflection into fragments. It looked abandoned. It looked dead. And yet, from deep inside, so soft he almost missed it, came a murmur. "It's too cramped." Alex froze, his blood turning cold. He spun toward the men. "Did you hear that?" They stared at him, baffled. Hear what? But Alex had already stepped back, his eyes locked on the dark mouth of the car. The whisper slid out again, this time just for him. "Come with me." The doors groaned, metal scraping as they began to close. Slowly, steadily, the gap narrowed. For a moment, before it sealed, he saw them, two faint eyes glowing in the dark, watching, waiting. Then the doors clanged shut. The men shifted uneasily. One cursed under his breath. Another crossed himself. The bearded man spoke again, softer now. "Get out of here. Don't look back." Alex nodded numbly, his legs moving before his mind caught up, dragging him across the garage toward the stairwell. Each step felt heavy, as though something clung to his ankles, slowing him down. The men's voices faded behind him. The hum of fluorescence buzzed overhead. The stairwell door groaned open under his hand, but just before he stepped through, he glanced back one last time. The elevator stood silent, dust clinging to its seams, the panel dark, the air around it still. No hum, no glow, no sound, just dead steel. And yet he felt it, the weight of its gaze, the press of its whisper inside his skull. "You already said yes." That night, Alex left every lamp in his apartment burning. He sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for a sound he could not name. The city outside was quiet, the hum of his refrigerator steady, but the silence inside felt heavier than any noise. He tried to tell himself he was safe, that the elevator was far behind him, that he had walked away, but every shadow in the room pulsed faintly, as though breathing. When exhaustion dragged him under, he stretched out on his bed without undressing, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Sleep came in ragged fragments. Each time he closed his eyes, he felt it, the mattress dipping beside him, the weight of something lowering itself into the dark. And then, against his ear, colder than breath, softer than thought, came the voice. "There is no morning." His eyes flew open, but the room remained unchanged. The lamps still burned, the ceiling still hovered above him. And yet, in the silence that followed, one of the bulbs flickered, just once, like a wink. The whisper in the restroom. The campus had been silent for years, and yet as Sarah stepped through the rusted gate, she felt the weight of its history pressing against her skin, as though the air itself carried the faint echo of hundreds of voices that no longer belonged to living students. The Gothic spires rose into the sky like skeletal fingers, their stone edges darkened by rain, the carved gargoyles hunched and patient, staring with blind eyes at the courtyard below. She adjusted the strap of her satchel, hugging it close as if the notebooks inside could protect her, and tried to steady her breathing. She had come here for research, she reminded herself, not for ghost stories or urban legends. The university had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, a victim of financial collapse and disrepair, and its reputation for haunting was just another layer of folklore painted over crumbling walls. She was a graduate student in architecture, not a thrill seeker, but even as she thought it, the silence unnerved her. The sound of her boots echoed against the cracked flagstones far louder than seemed natural, ricocheting off hollow windows, circling back at her like whispers in a language she did not understand. She told herself that acoustics behaved strangely in ruins, that the emptiness of the campus made every sound travel farther, but the explanation did little to calm the shiver that threaded her spine. She passed beneath the arched entryway, into the main hall. The heavy wooden doors resisted her push, their hinges groaning in protest before they gave way, and she stepped into a vast space that smelled of dust and mildew. Shafts of pale light filtered through stained glass windows fractured by time, the colored panes casting broken shapes across the floor. The vaulted ceiling stretched far above, ribbed with stone that reminded her of the inside of a cathedral. Dust motes drifted in the air, suspended as though the space had been waiting for her alone. She took out her phone, snapping photographs of the architecture, noting the pointed arches and the carved details that marked the university's ambition when it was built. In another era, she thought, this hall must have been filled with voices and footsteps, the living rhythm of learning. Now it was an echo chamber for the past. Her footsteps carried her deeper, past rows of doorways leading into empty lecture halls, each smelling faintly of chalk and damp wood. She peeked inside one and found long tables warped with age, chairs overturned, the blackboard streaked with ghostly lines where words had once been written and erased. In another, she found piles of books left to rot, their pages curled and yellowed, their spines collapsed in surrender. She paused to run a finger over one, and it crumbled beneath her touch, the paper disintegrating into ash-like flakes. She pressed on, following the map she had printed, though most of it was unnecessary. The campus was not large, and her goal was clear. The university was famous, in its way, not for the classes once taught, but for the building itself, a stubborn Gothic relic built during a time when such flourishes had already begun to fade from architectural fashion. Sarah had always been fascinated by places that seemed out of step with their time, places that clung to a vision the world had already abandoned. She wanted to see its details up close, to sketch the arches, the tiling, the strange blend of grandeur and decay. The restrooms had caught her attention during her research. In photographs, they were described as ornate for their purpose, lined with intricate tilework and carved doors, as though even private spaces had been designed to reflect the Gothic aesthetic. She had read that much of the detailing still remained, preserved by the damp, and she had come to see for herself. She had not intended to think of the rumors, but of course she could not forget them. Stories of a student who had died there, locked in a stall, heart failing in the solitude. Stories of late-night crying that echoed through the empty building long after the university had closed. Stories she told herself were exaggerations, and yet the thought followed her as she descended the stairwell into the lower floor. The light grew dimmer, the deeper she went, the air colder, the silence thicker. She ran her hand along the stone railing, its surface rough and gritty, until her palm was dusted with gray. The stairwell opened into a corridor, narrower than those above, its ceiling low and pipes running exposed along its length. The smell of mildew grew stronger, mingled with the faint sting of rust. She followed the corridor until she found the sign, its letters tarnished but still legible. Restroom. The door beneath it was wooden, swollen from damp, its paint peeling in long strips. She pressed her palm against it, felt the resistance of swollen hinges, and pushed until it opened with a groan. The smell inside was stronger, a blend of damp tile, rusted metal, and the faint ammonia of places long uncleaned. The room was larger than she expected, lined with stalls along one side and a row of porcelain sinks along the other. The tiles on the floor were cracked, many missing, revealing the concrete beneath. But along the walls the decorative Gothic patterns remained, faded but intricate. She raised her phone to capture the details, snapping images of the carved molding above the mirrors, the pointed arches even here, as though the architect had wanted every inch of the building to sing the same hymn. Her footsteps echoed strangely, the sound bouncing too many times before fading. She paused, tilting her head, certain she had heard something behind her. She turned slowly, her breath held, but the room was empty. Only her reflection met her gaze in the cracked mirror above the sinks, her face pale, her dark hair framing eyes that looked more nervous than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was nothing, just acoustics again, just the strangeness of abandoned spaces. But as she lowered the phone, as she moved further into the restroom, she heard it, soft at first, a sound that could have been the wind in the pipes, or the settling of old walls, a sound that trembled on the edge of being a voice. Then clearer, a sob, a muffled, broken sob, as though someone were crying only a few feet away. Sarah froze. The sound came again, unmistakable this time, the ragged hitch of breath between tears, the voice of someone in despair. She turned slowly, eyes darting between the stalls, the mirrors, the corners. Her throat tightened. The restroom was empty. She had checked, but the crying did not stop. It grew a little louder, a little closer. She could almost make out words between the sobs. A plea dragged into the silence. "Help me." Sarah's breath caught. The word was too clear to be imagination. It had the timbre of a real voice, young and female, fragile. Her skin prickled as goose flesh raced along her arms. She took a slow step backward, then another, her eyes sweeping the room for movement. Nothing stirred. The mirrors showed only her. The stalls stood closed, their wooden doors warped and peeling. The crying seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing along the tiles, vibrating in the pipes, filling the hollow space. She whispered to herself, "It's just wind. It's just the building settling." But the voice came again, soft and trembling, unmistakable. "Please, help me." Her throat closed, her breath shallow. She tightened her grip on her phone until her knuckles whitened, the weak glow of its flashlight beam trembling across the cracked tiles. She wanted to run, to push back through the door into the corridor, but her feet did not move. Some part of her mind, the part trained in observation, rooted her to the spot. She wanted to see, to know, to understand whether the sound came from a flaw in the building or from something else entirely. She took a slow step forward, the sound of her boot against the tile too loud, too final. The crying faltered for a moment, then resumed, softer now, like someone aware of being overheard. Sarah swallowed hard and whispered, "Hello? Is someone there?" Her words echoed back at her, distorted by the hollow room, as though another voice had repeated them an instant too late. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. It was thick, watching, waiting. She stood frozen in the center of the restroom, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath trembling in the cold air. And just as she turned to retreat, just as she told herself she had imagined it all, the voice came again. "Don't open the door." Sarah stood frozen in the half-light, her phone trembling in her grip, the cracked tiles reflecting the beam in scattered shards. The words lingered in the damp air, softer than breath, yet heavy enough to pin her in place. "Don't open the door." The syllables curled into her ears and refused to leave, settling deep in her chest until her heartbeat stumbled against them. She swallowed, the dryness in her throat sharp and painful, and forced herself to breathe. She told herself that buildings made sounds, that pipes spoke when air passed through them, that the mind was eager to shape echoes into words when fear was already present. And yet her skin prickled with goose flesh, every nerve certain that someone had spoken to her, not from memory, not from within her imagination, but from right there, only a wall's thickness away. The stalls stretched before her in a row, their wooden doors warped and bowed, the paint peeling in long curls, the metal hinges furred with rust. Some were closed, some hung open just enough to show the dark interior, and each one seemed to breathe in its own rhythm, shadows deepening and fading as if something unseen shifted inside. She took a cautious step closer, her boot scraping against tile. The sound was swallowed by silence, then echoed back faintly as though mimicked. She raised the phone higher, the beam cutting across the doors, lingering on the smallest details, the faint smears of water stains, the graffiti carved decades earlier into the wood, the faint suggestion of initials, names forgotten but preserved in scars. Her breath fogged faintly in the air. She frowned at the sight of it. The building had been cold when she entered, but not like this, not biting enough to condense her breath. She exhaled again deliberately, watching the faint cloud twist and dissolve. Something about it made the room feel less like a ruin and more like a freezer, the air preserved for something not yet finished. She turned slowly, sweeping the light across the mirrors. Her own reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed, hair spilling forward from beneath the hood of her coat. For a heartbeat, just long enough to question herself, she thought her reflection had moved differently, its lips parting in a shape she had not made. She blinked hard, forcing the image away, and turned back to the stalls. The crying began again. It was softer this time, a muted whimper, as though muffled by walls. It came from the second stall on the right. She was certain of it. The sound pressed against the wood like a body leaning in despair. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to believe it was a person, a girl who had somehow found her way into the abandoned building, someone in need of help, but the rational part of her mind rejected it immediately. The campus had been closed for years. The doors had been locked and rusted shut. She had fought with the front gate herself, had seen the courtyard overgrown and untouched. No one else should be here. "Hello?" she whispered, the word trembling out of her throat before she could stop it. The crying faltered, paused, as though listening. Sarah held her breath. The voice returned, closer now, whispering through sobs. "Please, don't open the door." Her chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to escape before the voice could take shape. But another part of her, the part that had led her into the ruin in the first place, kept her rooted. She was here to observe, to document, to face what history had left behind. And so, with trembling hands, she stepped forward. The stall door rattled. The sound burst out of the silence like an explosion, a violent clatter of wood against frame, metal against rusted hinge. Sarah gasped and stumbled backward, nearly dropping her phone. The beam swung wild across the walls, the ceiling, before finding the stall again. The door was shaking as if something inside pounded against it, desperate to be released. The cry rose higher, sharper, no longer muffled. "Don't open it. Don't open it." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, muffling her own gasp. Her knees trembled beneath her. She backed toward the sinks, the cracked mirror behind her, her body torn between fleeing through the door and remaining frozen where she stood. The rattling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was worse, suffocating, each second stretching until she could not bear it. She strained to listen, her ears aching in the cold, but there was nothing. Not crying, not whispers, only the distant drip of water in a pipe, a sound so small it felt staged, as though the building itself were mocking her. She whispered, so faintly she was unsure she had spoken aloud. "Who are you?" The silence stretched, then faintly a whimper. "Please, don't open the door." Sarah's vision blurred with tears she had not felt forming, the sheer unnatural weight of the voice pressing against her senses. She shook her head, whispering back, "I won't. I promise I won't." The wood creaked softly, as though in response. She waited another moment, her body taut with dread, then slowly back toward the entrance. Her hand fumbled for the door handle. It felt colder than ice beneath her fingers, the chill burning her skin. She hesitated, glancing back at the stalls. The second door stood still now, closed and silent, indistinguishable from the others except for the weight of what she had heard behind it. She turned the handle and slipped into the corridor, pulling the restroom door shut behind her. The groan of hinges echoed like a sigh. The hallway was dim, lined with pipes that dripped condensation onto the floor, the air thick with damp. Sarah leaned against the wall, pressing her palm to her chest, feeling the frantic rhythm of her heart. She whispered to herself over and over, "It's just acoustics. It's just a story. It's just the building." But the words did not calm her. They sounded hollow in her own ears, like lies told by someone else. And then, just as her breath began to steady, just as she told herself she would leave the building altogether, the voice came again. Not from behind the restroom door this time, from further down the corridor. "Help me." Sarah's head snapped up. At the far end of the hall, beyond the weak glow of her phone, something stirred. A faint shape, indistinct, as though carved from shadow. Her blood turned cold. The whisper echoed again, stronger now, carried on air that seemed to move only in her direction. "Help me." Her breath caught. She took a step back toward the restroom, then stopped. She could not go back in. The voice there had told her not to open the door, and now another voice, or perhaps the same, was calling from deeper inside. Her body trembled between choices, her mind a whirlwind of terror and curiosity, the old instinct to run fighting with the strange compulsion to see what waited in the shadows of the abandoned school. Sarah's boots hesitated against the damp concrete floor, her steps shallow, as though the very act of moving forward might break the spell of silence that had briefly settled. Her breath wavered in her chest, fogging faintly in the chill corridor, and she told herself again that it was only a trick of acoustics, only her imagination weaving sound out of shadow. Yet the voice had been too precise, too human, the plea for help carrying with it the fragile quiver of someone on the edge of despair. She tightened her grip on her phone until her knuckles whitened and lifted the light toward the far end of the hall. The beam shone weakly across pipes crusted with rust, over peeling paint. over the faint glisten of water trickling from cracks in the ceiling. The shape she thought she had seen was gone, or perhaps had never been there. The corridor stretched ahead, narrow and unyielding, fading into shadow. She took one step forward, then another, her heart pounding so loudly that she wondered if the sound might echo back at her. The voice came again, this time closer. "Please, help me." She froze, the words sinking into her bones. Not loud, but weighted, so clear that for an instant she was certain someone stood just around the next bend, hidden from view. Her rational mind scrambled for explanation. A trespasser, a squatter, someone who had slipped into the ruin for shelter. But the voice carried no footsteps, no breathing, no scrape of shoes or shuffle of clothing. Only the words, floating alone in the damp. She forced her throat to open, whispering into the silence, "Where are you?" The corridor breathed in response, the pipes groaning faintly, water dripping faster. Then, just at the edge of her hearing, the faintest whimper. "Don't open the door." Her stomach turned. She remembered the second stall rattling, the frantic warning. Her skin prickled cold. How could the voice be both here and there? How could it move without sound? How could it repeat itself with such desperate consistency? She backed up a step, colliding with the restroom door behind her. The handle pressed into her back, a reminder of where she had been. She thought of pushing through, returning to the relative safety of the tiled room, but the memory of the rattling stall made her throat close. Instead, she turned, forcing herself to continue down the hall. Her boots clicked softly against the damp floor, each step swallowed quickly by silence. She swept the beam from side to side, illuminating cracks, stains, fragments of broken glass. Her pulse raced, her body tense with the certainty that something moved just out of sight, that with each swing of the light she might catch the shape again, crouched and waiting. The corridor turned abruptly left. She rounded the corner, her breath tight, and found another doorway, its frame rotted, the wooden door sagging against its hinges. Beyond it lay another section of restroom, or perhaps an extension lined again with stalls. The tiles here were darker, slick with moisture, and the smell of mildew was stronger, thick in her nose and throat. She hesitated at the threshold, her body insisting she retreat, her curiosity dragging her forward. She lifted the phone higher, sweeping the light across the stalls. Most stood slightly open, revealing emptiness, but the third was shut, its surface smeared with something dark and long dried. She stepped closer. The crying returned. It was muffled now, low and broken, coming directly from the closed stall. Sarah's breath hitched. Her skin felt too tight, her pulse in her neck sharp. The sound carried all the weight of genuine suffering, the kind of raw despair that belonged to the living, not to imagination. She reached out with her free hand, her fingers trembling as they hovered inches from the wood. "Are you trapped?" she whispered. The crying stopped. The silence swelled. Then, slowly, softly, the answer came. "Don't open the door." Her hand jerked back as though burned. She stumbled a step away, her shoulder striking the wall, her phone beam shaking wildly. She stared at the stall, her body locked in a fight between terror and compassion. The voice had begged her for help, yet warned her not to act. What kind of plea was that? The stall door trembled faintly, rattling once as though something inside had shifted. The sound was subtle, yet in the silence it roared in her ears. Sarah's throat closed. She wanted to run, to abandon her research, her notes, the building itself, but her feet would not obey. She was rooted by a kind of fascination, horrified but compelled, desperate to understand what stood before her. The mirror at the far end of the room caught her eye. Cracked and clouded, it reflected her trembling figure in fragments, her face split into distorted pieces. But behind her, in the reflection, she thought she saw movement, a shadow, shifting, leaning from the side. She spun, her light sweeping the stalls. Empty, nothing stirred. She turned back to the mirror. The shadow was gone. Her chest tightened, her breath sharp and uneven. The cold grew deeper, wrapping around her ribs, seeping into her bones. She felt suddenly that she was not alone, not simply in the way that someone might be hidden, but in the way that the air itself had gained awareness, that the walls and pipes and cracked tiles had begun to watch. Then she felt it, a breath, not her own, not the faint fog of her exhale, but warm, damp, against the back of her neck. She gasped and spun, foam beam slashing across the air. Nothing. The stall stood still, the corridor empty, but the sensation lingered, as though lips had almost brushed her skin, as though someone had leaned close enough to whisper but changed their mind at the last instant. Her knees weakened, her vision swam, her body begging her to flee. The voice came again, right against her ear. "Help me," she screamed, stumbling back, her shoulder striking the stall door. The wood shuddered beneath the impact, rattling violently, the hinges screeching in protest. She spun, pressed both palms against the door to steady it, her body trembling. From within came a whimper, then the broken sobbing again, words barely audible between gasps. "Don't open! Don't open!" Sarah collapsed against the door, tears stinging her eyes, the weight of despair pressing on her chest. She wanted to speak, to promise again that she would not open, but her throat would not shape the words. She slid down the wood until she was crouched on the wet tile, her phone light tilted upward, catching the damp ceiling, the rusted pipes. The crying faded once more, leaving her in silence. Only the faint drip of water remained, tapping a rhythm into the stillness. Sarah pressed her forehead to her knees, whispering to herself, "It isn't real, it isn't real, I'm just tired, I'm just tired." But when she lifted her head again, when she dared to raise her eyes to the mirror at the far wall, she saw it, a girl, standing in the reflection, behind her crouched form, pale face, dark hair spilling over her shoulders, a white dress stained with damp. Her lips moved, though no sound carried. Sarah whipped her head around. The space behind her was empty. She turned back to the mirror. The girl was still there. And this time her voice reached Sarah's ears. Not muffled, not broken, but clear. "Don't leave me here." Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the cracked mirror, the figure of the girl frozen within its fractured surface. The pale face seemed to hover just behind her own reflection, the mouth moving with slow precision, shaping words that seeped into the silence even as the glass trembled with age. "Don't leave me here." The words clung to her skin like mist, sinking into her bones until she thought she might collapse beneath their weight. She dared a glance over her shoulder, the phone's trembling beam cutting through the damp air. But the stalls stood silent, the shadows unbroken. Nothing occupied the space behind her, nothing except what the mirror insisted was there. Her body quivered with the urge to run, to abandon the building, the research, the pretense of bravery, but some deeper instinct, colder and more curious, forced her to stay. She rose slowly from her crouch, every joint stiff, her breath catching in shallow gasps, and edged backward until she stood a few feet from the mirror. Her reflection wavered in the fractured surface, split into distorted shards, but the girl remained whole. She did not shift with the cracks. She stood perfect, pale, her dress white as bleached linen despite the grime that seemed to cling to every corner of the restroom. Sarah whispered, her voice shaking, "Who are you?" The girl tilted her head, her long dark hair spilling across her shoulders. Her lips parted again, but the sound that emerged was broken, layered, as though spoken not from a throat but from the walls themselves. "I'm trapped here. Don't go." Sarah's chest tightened. The words were pleading, drenched in sorrow, and yet something in them struck wrong. They did not carry the cadence of a living voice. They sounded stretched, hollow, too empty of breath. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry, and dared another step closer. The girl's eyes met hers. They were dark, deep as wells, without reflection. For a moment, Sarah felt herself drawn forward, her body tilting unconsciously toward the mirror, as if the glass had become an opening rather than a surface. She jerked back with a gasp, shaking her head violently. The spell broken, the crying returned, not from the mirror this time, but from the stalls behind her. It rose softly at first, then louder, echoing along the tiles until it seemed to come from every corner. Sarah spun, her light darting across each closed door, but none moved. The sound pressed closer anyway, like breath on her skin, weaving around her until she could not tell whether it was inside her head or outside. She clamped her free hand over her ear, but the sound did not lessen. Then, sudden and sharp, a single stall door rattled, the second one from the end, the same she had heard before. Wood smacked against frame, hinges screeching in protest. The the whole structure convulsing as though something inside slammed against it. Sarah staggered backward, her shoulder colliding with the sink. The cracked porcelain bit into her skin. She raised the phone desperately, light slicing across the rattling door. "Don't open the door," the voice cried, this time louder, frantic, as though the warning itself was pounding against the wood. Sarah's legs threatened to give beneath her. She forced herself upright, pressed against the sink, her body trembling as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. If someone was trapped, why beg not to be freed? If someone needed help, why reject it? Her thoughts twisted in circles until they blurred, her reason dissolving under the weight of fear. She turned back to the mirror, needing some anchor, some proof that her mind was not breaking. The girl still stood within the glass, unmoving, lips parted in silence now. Sarah's light flickered across her face, and for the first time she noticed something that made her stomach turn. The floor beneath the girl was bare. No shadow stretched behind her. No reflection from the beam of the phone glinted in her eyes. The glass seemed to hold her, but the world did not. Sarah's breath hitched sharply. She whispered, more to herself than to the figure, "You don't belong here." The girl tilted her head again, hair falling like a curtain, and her lips curved faintly into what might have been a smile. "Don't leave me," she whispered again, the voice soft, coaxing, almost tender. Sarah shook her head violently, tears stinging her eyes. She pressed her back harder against the sink, trying to anchor herself in the feel of cold porcelain, in the solidity of tile beneath her boots. But the air thickened, heavy and damp, pressing against her chest, until each breath was a labor. The light trembled in her hand, its beam faltering as the phone battery dwindled, and the restroom grew darker, the corners swelling with shadow that seemed to move of its own accord. The stall rattled again, louder this time, a furious shudder that sent flecks of rust flying from its hinges. The voice inside sobbed between words. "Don't. Open. Don't." The mirror girl raised her hand now, palm pressed flat against the inside of the glass, as though reaching toward Sarah, her eyes wide and desperate. Sarah screamed, the sound tearing from her throat before she could stop it. The noise echoed wildly, bouncing from wall to wall, doubling, tripling, until it felt as though a dozen voices screamed with her. She clamped her mouth shut, gasping for air, and backed toward the exit. The restroom door loomed only a few steps away. She fumbled for the handle, her hands slick with sweat, but froze when she heard it. A new voice, different from the sobbing, different from the pleading, low, steady, right at her ear. "Don't trust her." Sarah spun, her light slashing wildly. Nothing stood behind her. The air was empty. Her knees weakened. She pressed against the door, heart slamming against her ribs. The stall rattled harder, the sobbing rising to a wail, the mirror girl pressing her hand more firmly against the glass. The room roared with sound, overlapping voices, each whispering, each crying, each commanding, "Help me. Don't open the door. Don't leave me. Don't trust her." And Sarah covered her ears, tears streaking her cheeks, her whole body trembling under the weight of voices that filled the room. The door handle burned cold in her grip. She wrenched it down, shoved her weight against the wood, and stumbled into the corridor. The voices cut off at once. The silence was brutal, crushing in its suddenness. She sagged against the wall, panting, her phone beam trembling across the damp concrete. She dared a glance back. The restroom door hung open behind her, the shadows within deep and unmoving. She waited for a whisper, a cry, a rattle. None came. She turned and fled down the corridor, her boots splashing through shallow puddles, her breath ragged. But even as she ran, even as she put distance between herself and the tiled room, she felt the words clinging to her, echoing not in the air but inside her mind, looping over and over in voices, not her own. "Don't open the door. Don't leave me. Don't trust her." And beneath them all, softer than a sigh but sharp enough to chill her marrow, came the one that mattered most. "You can't leave." The air in the corridor was colder than before, though Sarah could not tell whether it was the building pressing its chill deeper into her skin, or whether the cold now lived inside her, lodged beneath her ribs. She moved with uneven steps, her boots scraping on the damp concrete, her phone beam lurching ahead in broken arcs. Every corner of the hall felt as though it might hold another door, another shadow, another whisper waiting to thread itself into her ears. But the silence held, vast and unbroken, except for the shallow tremor of her own breath. She reached the stairwell and gripped the rail with both hands, forcing her shaking legs upward. The stone steps groaned faintly under her weight, each rise carrying her further from the tiled rooms below, though she could not shake the sense that the building's lungs still breathed around her, that the walls themselves were aware of her leaving. She kept her eyes fixed on the steps ahead, afraid to glance over her shoulder, afraid of what shape the shadows might take if she dared. The main hall welcomed her with its fractured stained glass and its drifting dust, the vast silence so complete that she felt for a moment she might have dreamed the entire encounter. The air here was dry, lighter, lacking the suffocating damp of the lower floors. She crossed the flagstones quickly, her boots clicking in a rhythm that carried her toward the doors. Her hand shook as she pressed against the heavy wood, and when the hinges groaned open, the sound felt like release. The courtyard stretched before her, overgrown and silent beneath the night sky, the stone spires looming above, like watchful sentinels. Sarah stepped out, pulling the door shut behind her with a final heave. The click of its latch echoed through the courtyard, startling in its finality. She inhaled deeply, the cold air of the night stinging her lungs, and for the first time since entering the restroom, she felt her chest loosen. She crossed the courtyard without looking back, her hands trembling as she forced the gate open, its rusted bars screeching in protest. The street outside seemed strangely alive in comparison, even in its emptiness. The distant sound of a car, the faint glow of street lamps, the smell of wet asphalt, all of it wrapped around her like proof that she had returned to a world that obeyed ordinary rules. She walked quickly to her car, fumbling with the keys, nearly dropping them in her rush. When the door finally opened, and she collapsed into the driver's seat, she let herself cry, silent tears streaking down her cheeks as she pressed her forehead to the steering wheel. For a long time she did not move. She listened to the steady hum of the car once she started the engine, letting the vibration ground her, letting the headlights carve a path through the dark street. She drove away without glancing in the mirror, afraid that if she did, she might see something seated in the back, pale and silent, waiting. Days later, Sarah returned to her notes. She told herself she needed to make sense of it, that she could not allow her research to collapse under the weight of one night's terror. She sat in the quiet of her apartment, her books spread across the table, her laptop glowing in the dimness, and began to search. It did not take long to find the story. The university's closure had left a trail of articles and whispers, and buried among them was the account of a tragedy. A female student, young, bright, studying late. She had gone to the restroom one night and never returned. They said she had suffered a heart attack, sudden and cruel, and the stall had been locked from the inside. She had been discovered the next morning. Some whispered she had cried for help, her voice unheard in the empty halls. Others said she had not cried at all, that she had died instantly, but all agreed that she had not left the restroom alive. Sarah read the words with her throat tight, her breath shallow. The account matched the whispers she had heard, the desperate pleas, the sobs, and yet something troubled her. The articles mentioned her name, and photographs remained, grainy but clear. The girl had short hair, cropped close around her ears, and favored dark clothing. She had not worn white. She had not looked like the figure in the mirror. Sarah stared at the photograph until her eyes burned. The pale girl she had seen, the one who had pressed her hand against the glass, who had whispered, "Don't leave me," was not this student. She was someone else, or something else. The voices came back to her, layered and overlapping, contradicting one another. "Help me. Don't open the door. Don't leave me. Don't trust her." As if more than one presence had been speaking, as if more than one truth had been hidden in the tiles and shadows of that restroom. She shut her laptop, unable to read more. The silence of her apartment pressed around her. For a moment it was a comfort, ordinary and safe. Then, faintly, she heard it. A drip, a slow, steady drip, though no faucet was running. She held her breath, straining to listen. The sound seemed to come from the corner of the room, then from the ceiling, then from everywhere at once, and beneath it, softer than a breath, a whisper, "Don't open the door." Sarah pressed her palms to her ears, tears stinging her eyes. She whispered to herself, "It isn't real. It's just memory." But the whisper persisted, repeating itself, wrapping around her like a shroud, and with it came another, overlapping, almost tender. "Don't leave me." Her lights flickered once, briefly dimming before returning. She froze, her breath caught, her heart hammering. She stared at the walls, at the shadows gathering in the corners. The whispers faded slowly, like water receding into drains, but they left their weight behind. She knew then what she had suspected since the moment she stepped out of the restroom. She had not truly left it. Not all of her. The building, the stalls, the mirrors, they had only lent her back to the world for a time. And sooner or later, the voices would call her home. The shadow on the wall. John had always noticed shadows before he noticed people. It was a habit he could not explain, one that had followed him since childhood, when he used to trace the outlines of his classmates on the playground and realize, before anyone else, who was sneaking up behind him. As a man, the tendency had never left, and in his line of work it had sharpened into something close to instinct. He worked for a small company contracted by the city, the kind of company no one thought about until a building collapsed or a crime scene had to be cleared. Rescue, they called it on paper, but often it meant entering spaces no one wanted to step into, places heavy with mold and silence, places that seemed to cling to the memories of what had happened within their walls. Most of his co-workers hated the job. They moved quickly, did what they had to do, and got out. But John had always lingered, studying the way light bent through broken windows, the way shadows stretched too long across warped walls. He had learned to read them, in his own way. A shadow could tell you whether a floor was safe, whether a wall had shifted, whether someone else had passed through recently. But sometimes the shadows told him more. Sometimes they told him who had once been there, long after the person was gone. That ability, if that was what it could be called, had unsettled him for years, though he never spoke of it. He had learned the cost of confession early, when as a boy he told his parents that his grandmother's shadow had lingered in the hallway for 3 nights after her burial. They had looked at him with pity at first, then discomfort, and finally silence. He had kept it to himself ever since. On the night he was sent to the old house on Miller Street, the air was sharp with early autumn, and the sun had already sunk below the horizon. His co-workers had finished their inspection earlier in the day, marking the place as stable but in need of cleanup. His supervisor had asked him to take one last look, to make sure the back rooms were clear. It was the kind of errand John received often, trusted to notice things others overlooked. The house stood at the edge of town, surrounded by weeds that reached to the porch, its windows boarded or broken, its siding gray and peeling. The front door hung ajar, its hinges swollen with rust. As John stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned beneath his weight, and the smell of damp earth rose around him. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior beyond, and then stepped inside. The air was close, heavy with dust and mildew. His flashlight cut a narrow beam through the dark, illuminating faded wallpaper and warped floorboards. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the house. He moved slowly, his boots crunching against broken glass, his breath loud in the emptiness. And then he saw it. On the wall to his left, cast across the faded wallpaper, was the shadow of a boy, small, no older than 8 or 9, his head bent in concentration. The shape of his arms moved in the unmistakable rhythm of play, lifting and lowering something in his hands. Beside him, another shadow moved, angular, mechanical, its edges sharp. A toy robot. The boy crouched, the robot lurched, their forms joined in the silent theater of light. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. He swung his flashlight across the floor, across the corner where the boy should have been, but the space was empty. Only dust, only broken furniture. Not child, not toy. Yet the shadows remained, dancing lightly on the wall, untouched by his beam. He watched as the boy's head tilted back, a gesture of delight, and the robot's arms jerked upward, as if in mimicry. The play continued in silence, precise, real in every motion. John's pulse hammered in his chest, his instinct screaming that this was no ordinary shadow. He had seen echoes before, imprints of people long gone, but they were faint, brief, gone as soon as noticed. This was solid, continuous, alive. He stepped closer, his light trembling in his hand. The shadows paid him no mind, absorbed in their play. For a moment, he almost believed he was intruding on something private, something sacred. He crouched slightly, tilting his head, trying to understand the angle of light that could have cast such figures. but there was no light source behind him except his own beam, and the angles made no sense. The boy had no body, the robot no substance, and yet their shadows clung to the wall as if painted there by some invisible hand. John whispered, though he did not know why, "Who are you?" The shadows did not answer. The boy lifted the robot higher, his arms stretching upward, and the robot's silhouette expanded, its sharp edges distorting as it climbed the wallpaper. John's skin prickled. He took another step forward, then another, until he stood almost within the reach of the figures. The boy's shadow froze. Its head turned, slowly, deliberately, until the hollow oval of its face aligned with him. John's stomach dropped. He could not see eyes, only darkness, but he felt the weight of its gaze all the same. The play stopped. The robot hung in stillness, its angular form suspended mid-motion. The boy's shadow straightened, its small shoulders squaring, as if acknowledging an audience. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the shadow lowered the robot, set it on the ground, and stepped backward. And in that moment, John realized something that made his chest tighten with dread. The boy's shadow no longer aligned with the room. It did not belong to the floor, the walls, or any angle of light. It belonged only to itself. He swept his flashlight across the wall, desperate for explanation, but the beam passed through the shadow without disturbing it. The boy remained fixed, its form separate from the real world. John's throat felt dry, his voice small when he whispered again, "Why are you here?" The boy's shadow tilted its head, the motion almost curious, almost gentle. Then it turned and walked deeper into the wall, its form slipping out of sight, as though vanishing into stone. The robot remained behind for a moment longer, its sharp silhouette twitching once, twice, before collapsing into nothing. The wall was bare. Only faded wallpaper remained, its floral pattern peeling, its surface cracked. John stood frozen, his light sweeping the emptiness, his body rigid with the certainty that he had witnessed something meant to remain unseen. He forced himself to breathe, slow and shallow, and turned toward the rest of the house. He had come to inspect, he reminded himself. He had come to make sure the rooms were clear. And yet every instinct told him the house was not empty, that it had never been empty, that its walls still held something waiting to be found. He moved deeper, each step slow, his light trembling as it traced the corners. The silence pressed close again, but beneath it he thought he heard something faint, a whisper, a child's voice, muffled, carried through the walls. "Help me." John's hand tightened on the flashlight, his knuckles aching. The voice came again, softer, almost a breath. "Help me." He swallowed hard, his pulse sharp against his temples. He turned toward the sound, toward the deeper rooms, where the walls narrowed and the dark grew heavier. And on the faded wallpaper ahead, just for a moment, a small shadow flickered into being. The boy again crouched low, the robot at his side, waiting. John did not sleep that night. He drove home in silence, the glow of the dashboard lights casting pale blue across his face, his knuckles rigid on the wheel. He tried to tell himself that what he had seen in the house was nothing more than fatigue playing tricks, the residue of too many late nights and too many rooms filled with echoes of grief. Shadows had always fascinated him. Perhaps his own imagination had turned that fascination against him. But when he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The small boy crouched on the wall, the toy robot twitching in his hands, the slow turn of the head as it noticed him. He lay awake in the dark, staring at his ceiling, waiting for the familiar patterns of headlights to move across the walls. But each passing car cast ordinary shadows, honest reflections of the world outside, and he could not find comfort in them. By morning, he had made a decision. He told himself it was professional diligence, the same instinct that had always set him apart from his coworkers. But deeper than that, he knew it was obsession. He needed to know who the boy was, why his shadow lingered in a house that should have been empty. He needed to understand what he had seen, because without understanding, he knew it would never release him. His first stop was the city's records office, a cramped building with peeling paint and the scent of dust embedded in its walls. He requested the property files for the Miller Street house, offering the clerk a practiced smile that disguised his urgency. She disappeared into the back and returned with a stack of folders, their edges frayed, their pages yellowed. John spread them out across the table and began to read. The house had been built in the 1,940 seconds, a modest two-story structure that had passed through several owners over the decades. Maintenance reports were sparse, but police records filled the gaps. A burglary in the late 1990 seconds, a break-in in 2004, and then, one file thicker than the others, its edges stained. He opened it and scanned the report. A boy, 8 years old, found dead inside the house during a botched robbery. He had been playing in the living room with a toy robot when the intruder broke in. The report was clinical, detached, but John could feel the weight between the lines. The boy had been alone. The killer had fled, caught days later, but the boy's life had already ended. The house had stood empty for years after, finally passing into neglect. John closed the folder slowly, his chest heavy. The image of the shadow playing on the wall sharpened in his mind, no longer abstract but tethered to a name, a story. He whispered the boy's name softly, almost reverently, as though speaking it aloud might anchor him. He spent the rest of the day chasing fragments, newspaper clippings that spoke of the tragedy, interviews with neighbors who remembered the boy's laughter, photographs faded with age. In one, the boy grinned at the camera, his toy robot clutched tightly in his hands. The shadow John had seen was identical, the tilt of the head, the curve of small shoulders. It had not been his imagination. It had been memory made visible. But why? Why had the shadow remained when the body was gone? Why had it noticed him? That night, against every instinct of self-preservation, John returned to the house. The sky was overcast, the moon smothered, and the air smelled faintly of rain. The porch groaned beneath his boots as before. The door resisted his push, and the silence inside closed around him like a fist. He lifted his flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust, and stepped into the living room. The wall was empty. For a moment he felt both relief and disappointment, as though the absence of the shadow proved and denied him at once. He walked deeper, his light sweeping across the peeling wallpaper, the broken furniture, the long cracks in the ceiling. He whispered the boy's name into the silence, his voice trembling, and then, faint and sudden, the shadow flickered back into being. It appeared not where it had before, but further down the hall, small and crouched, the robot at its side. John's breath caught. He stepped forward cautiously, his light trembling as it illuminated the bare floor, the empty air where the child should have stood. The shadow played, arms lifting, head tilting, the robot twitching beside him. John's throat tightened as he watched, his heart aching with the fragile innocence of the scene. But then the boy stopped. The shadow froze mid-motion, its small hands hovering above the robot. Slowly, deliberately, its head turned toward him. John felt the gaze like a weight pressing against his chest. The darkness where the eyes should have been was bottomless, and though he knew it was only absence, he felt stared at all the same. He whispered, his voice hoarse, "What do you want?" The boy lifted a hand, not in play this time, not in innocence. The shadow's arm rose slowly, its small fingers curling as though pointing directly at him. John stumbled backward, his shoulder colliding with the wall. His light wavered, but the shadow did not dissolve. It remained fixed, its arm raised, its gaze unbroken. The robot twitched once, then stilled, and then, faint as a breath, came the voice. "Help me." John's skin prickled cold. His breath caught in his throat. The voice did not echo. It did not sound distant. It came from the wall itself, as though the paint and plaster had spoken. He whispered back, desperate, "How? How can I help you?" The shadow lowered its hand. Its form wavered, blurring at the edges, then sank into the wall until only darkness remained. The living room stood empty once more. John leaned against the wall, his knees weak, his chest heaving. He knew then that he could not leave it alone. The shadow had acknowledged him, had spoken to him. It was not simply an imprint of tragedy. It was aware. And if it was aware, then it was waiting. John told himself he would not return. He told himself as he drove home, as he lay awake in the narrow bed that felt suddenly too large for one man alone, as he sipped bitter coffee the next morning and stared at his reflection in the kitchen window. He whispered the promise aloud, as though saying it might make it true. "I won't go back." But the house pulled at him like a tide. Every shadow he saw, cast by passing headlights, by the sway of a tree, by his own body in the morning sun, reminded him of the boy's outline, small and delicate, crouched over the robot. His gift, curse, whatever it was, had always been something he endured. Now, for the first time, it demanded something of him. By nightfall, he was already driving back. The neighborhood was darker than before, the street lamps along Miller Street dead or dimmed, their lights struggling through moth-eaten halos. The house rose from the weeds like a forgotten memory, its roof sagging, its windows blind. John parked at the curb and sat for a moment with the engine off, his hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the faint tick of cooling metal. The world outside felt unnaturally still. He told himself again to leave, to go home, to let the past bury itself. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The porch moaned under his boots. The front door resisted his push, then yielded with a groan, its sound swallowed quickly by the dark interior. He lifted his flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust. The living room walls greeted him with their faded wallpaper, their peeling seams, their silence. At first, nothing stirred. He walked slowly across the warped boards, his light sweeping each corner. His breath fogged faintly in the cold. Then, just at the edge of the beam, a flicker, a blur of movement across the far wall. The boy's shadow. It darted quickly, small limbs pumping, the shape of the robot lurching beside him. The figures ran along the plaster as though chasing one another, then vanished around the corner into the hall. John's chest tightened. He stepped after them, his boots heavy on the floor, his light trembling as he followed. The shadows flickered again, further down the hall, slipping out of sight. He quickened his pace, heart hammering, each breath sharp in the cold. "Wait," he whispered, though his voice cracked, the word more plea than command. The shadow appeared again, this time on the wall to his left. The boy crouched low, the robot at his side. John froze, his light steady on the wall. The boy lifted his head slowly, deliberately, and turned to face him. "Help me," the voice whispered, faint but clear, seeping from the plaster like damp. John swallowed hard. He whispered back, "How? Tell me how." The boy's outline twitched, blurred, then ran. His small form darted along the wall, the robot lurching beside him, faster this time, urgent. They slipped around the next corner into darkness. John followed, his pulse roaring in his ears. The corridor stretched ahead, narrow, its walls pressing close. His flashlight beam wavered across cracked paint, over exposed beams, over stains long dried. He heard the boy's footsteps, or thought he did, light and quick, echoing faintly though no real feet touched the floor. He turned another corner. The shadows waited. The boy stood still now, his shape trembling, the robot at his feet. He lifted a hand, pointing down the hall. His voice came again, weaker, strained. "Help me, please." John's throat tightened. "I'm trying," he whispered. "Just show me what you want." The boy's arm lowered. The shadow shivered, then broke into a run once more, darting deeper into the house, into a place where the light did not reach. John followed, each step slower than the last, his breath ragged, his body taut with dread. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower, the air thick with damp. The smell of mold and something metallic filled his nose, sharp and sickly. His light wavered, struggling against the weight of the dark. Ahead, the boy's shadow appeared again, larger this time, stretched, its proportions wrong. The robot's arms jerked violently, its outline distorted. The boy turned his head toward John once more, and his voice came in a ragged whisper, torn and desperate. "He's coming." The words froze John's blood. His hand trembled so violently that the beam of light quaked across the wall, distorting the shadow further. The boy crouched low, clutching the robot, his form shrinking as though hiding. John whispered, hoarse, "Who's coming?" The silence that followed was worse than the voice. Then the shadow flickered, darting into the next room. John forced his legs to move, his boots dragging across the warped floor, his breath tearing from his chest. He stepped through the doorway into a smaller room, a bedroom once, perhaps, its wallpaper peeled, its ceiling stained. The smell was stronger here, mold and rust, damp earth, and something else. His light swept across the wall. The boy's shadow stood against it, motionless now. The robot lay at his feet, limp, its sharp edges dulled. The boy's arms hung at his sides, his head tilted slowly upward, and for the first time John saw his face. Not features, not eyes or mouth, but a hollow darkness where they should have been. The whisper came again, so close it seemed to bloom from the air itself. "Help me." John's chest seized. He took a stumbling step forward, then stopped. His light flickered, the beam weakening, the battery dying. In the dimming glow, the boy's shadow began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, his small form darting along the wall, running in frantic circles, the robot twitching behind him. The motion grew wilder, desperate, the shadow flinging itself against corners, stretching, distorting. John staggered back, his breath harsh. He whispered, "I don't know how. I don't know what you want." The boy froze, and then, in a voice softer than breath, the words changed. "Don't let him take me." The whisper pressed against John's ears, his skin, his bones. The boy's shadow crouched low, trembling, clutching the robot tight. John stood frozen, his light flickering, his body cold. For the first time he realized he was not alone with the boy. There was something else in the house, something the shadow feared. And it had not yet revealed itself. John's flashlight stuttered in his grip, the beam thinning to a weak, trembling cone that barely licked the walls. Each flicker of darkness made his chest seize, because with each blink the boy's shadow seemed to change, to grow, to twist into something larger. It was no longer the neat outline of a child crouching over a toy. It stretched long across the plaster, its arms elongating like tar pulling apart, its head lolling sideways as if straining to look both at him and at something beyond. The robot, too, distorted. Its jerks became violent, its edges spiking out at impossible angles, until it looked more like a trap with snapping jaws than a child's toy. John pressed his back against the doorframe, his breath shallow, his throat closing. The boy's whisper came again, but not from the wall. It slid into his ear as though spoken from right beside him. "Don't let him take me." He spun, his light slicing through the empty room, catching only dust and peeling wallpaper. No one stood there. No one ever stood there. And yet his skin burned where the breath should have been, hot and damp against his neck. He pressed himself tighter into the frame, the wood groaning beneath his weight, and stared at the wall. The boy's shadow trembled, twitching, clutching the robot closer. And then it ran. It darted along the wall with a speed that made John's stomach drop, its form elongated by the angles of the plaster, sprinting into the far corner where the darkness swallowed it whole. The robot clattered behind, its jagged silhouette snapping in and out of shape, then vanishing with a violent twitch. John's legs carried him forward before he realized it, the instinct to follow overpowering the voice in his head that screamed to leave. His boots scraped against the warped floor, his hand slick on the flashlight, his breath ragged. He turned the corner. The wall was alive. Shadows churned across it in a frenzy, overlapping and writhing, as though dozens of figures pressed against the plaster, all trying to escape at once. Among them, the boy flickered, small and frantic, his arms flailing. The robot dragged behind him. But larger shapes surrounded him now, towering shadows with limbs that bent the wrong way, faces smeared into smudges of darkness. They shifted with impossible angles, their outlines stretching floor to ceiling, their movements jagged, unhuman. One of them broke forward. It detached from the writhing mass and surged along the wall, its long arms sweeping wide. Its head swelled as it came, the blank oval where its face should have been gaping open into a maw of shadow. The boy's figure shrank back, clutching the robot tighter, trembling. John staggered away, his back colliding with the opposite wall, his light jerking wildly. The massive shadow lunged, its hand flattening against the plaster, its fingers stretching across half the room. The wall groaned under the weight, cracks splitting through the faded wallpaper, as though the house itself strained to contain the force. John screamed, the sound breaking out of him raw and involuntary, and stumbled sideways into the hall. The boy's whisper returned, louder now, ragged with terror. "Don't let him take me. Don't let him." The voice cut off in a choke, smothered by the roar of the larger shadow pressing closer. John ran. His flashlight beam slashed across doorways, catching glimpses of broken furniture, sagging wallpaper, stains that writhed in the corner of his eye but vanished when he looked directly. The house moaned around him, the floor buckling beneath his boots, the air thick with damp and dust. He could feel the weight of the shadow chasing him, its movements vibrating through the walls, rattling the very frame of the house. He turned sharply into the living room, his chest heaving, his lungs burning. His light swept across the far wall, and there was the boy again. The small shadow crouched low, trembling. The robot clutched to his chest. His outline wavered, flickering as though the larger presence were pulling at him, tearing him from the wall piece by piece. His voice came again, desperate, high-pitched with fear. "Help me." John's throat tore as he shouted back. "Tell me how." The boy lifted his head, his hollow face turning directly toward him. His lips moved, but no sound came. Behind him, the larger shadow surged closer, its massive arms reaching, its distorted body bending across the corners of the room. The boy's outline convulsed, half of it already stretching toward the monster, pulled like fabric tearing. And then, faintly, softer than a sigh, the words reached John's ears. "Take me with you." His stomach clenched. The meaning hit him like a blow. The boy didn't want him to open a door or break the wall. He wanted to be carried out through John himself. The massive shadow lunged, slamming into the wall. The house shuddered violently, dust raining from the ceiling, boards cracking beneath the force. The boy's outline shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound at all, but vibration, rattling John's teeth and bones. His small body stretched thinner, torn between the two presences, his arms flailing. John staggered forward, his light swinging wildly. The boy's outline reached toward him, trembling, distorted fingers stretching from the plaster as though they could brush his skin. The whisper cut through the roar, sharp and clear. "Take me." For one heartbeat, John almost lifted his hand, almost pressed it against the wall, almost allowed the boy's shadow to merge with his own. The thought filled his chest with crushing cold, with a weight that promised never to leave. Then the larger shadow struck again. Its massive arm swept across the plaster, shattering the boy's form into fragments. The robot shattered too, its angular limbs breaking apart, scattering like shards of glass. The house screamed with the sound, a guttural groan that echoed through the beams. John staggered backward, nearly dropping his light. The boy's figure flickered violently, shrinking, shuddering. His voice came one last time, strangled, broken. "Don't let him take me." And then he was gone. The wall went still. The room was empty. John stood trembling, sweat soaking his shirt, his breath ragged. He stared at the wall, waiting for movement, for the return of the shadows, but only silence answered. Then, slowly, he realized his own shadow was wrong. He looked down, at the floor where his body should have cast a clear outline in the weak beam. It was stretched, distorted, its arms too long, its head tilted at an angle that did not match his own. And as he stared, the distorted shadow moved half a beat out of sync with him, its hollow face turning toward his. John stumbled backward, his lungs burning, his hands slick on the flashlight that sputtered weakly in his grip. The distorted shadow at his feet bent and twisted, its limbs too long, its head cocked at that impossible angle, its hollow face tilting toward his own. For a moment he was certain he would collapse, certain that if he so much as blinked, the thing would crawl up out of the floor and merge with him, filling his skin like an empty coat. Instead, instinct broke the paralysis. He ran. The house swallowed the sound of his boots, swallowed his ragged breath, swallowed the panicked scrape of his shoulder against the peeling wallpaper as he stumbled down the corridor. The air seemed thicker now, as if the walls were pressing inward, the house intent on holding him just a little longer. He could feel the weight of shadows gathering in corners, sliding across door frames, trailing at his heels. He didn't dare look back. He forced his body forward, step after pounding step, until at last the front door loomed ahead, crooked on its hinges. He shoved it open with his shoulder, the wood splintering, and the night air crashed into him like water breaking over a drowning man. He stumbled onto the porch, down the steps, into the wild weeds that clawed at his legs. He didn't stop until he reached his car, fumbling the keys with trembling fingers, nearly dropping them twice before forcing the door open and collapsing inside. For a long time he simply sat there, his forehead pressed against the steering wheel, his chest heaving. The silence outside was immense, unbroken except for the faint rustle of dry grass. No footsteps followed, no whispers chased him. He told himself he had left it all inside the house, locked behind those rotten walls. He told himself again and again as he started the engine and pulled away, the headlights cutting through the overgrown drive. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, just for an instant. He thought he saw movement in the back seat, a dark shape, slouched and crooked. By the time he blinked, it was gone. He did not look again. The days that followed blurred together, but sleep never came easily. Each night he lay awake, listening to the creak of his apartment's old pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, the shuffle of neighbors' feet overhead. Harmless sounds, ordinary sounds, but each one seemed to carry the shape of something else. A whisper curled inside the noise. Shadows unsettled him now more than ever. The familiar silhouettes of his furniture, of his own body cast by the lamplight, no longer looked trustworthy. They seemed to linger half a beat too long when he moved. As though reluctant to follow, he returned to the records, combing through every mention of the house, every archived article. The details were clear enough. The boy's name, his age, the fact that he had been alone when the intruder broke in, and that his final moments were spent clutching the toy robot that was later found broken beside him. The tragedy had hung over the neighborhood for years, whispered by old residents, ignored by the city. But one detail caught John's attention and would not let go. A witness statement from a neighbor. She had heard the boy cry for help. She had run to call the police, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. She had sworn she heard not one voice, but two, the boy's and another, deeper, whispering low. The police had dismissed it. John could not. The memory of the massive shadow swelled in his mind, the way it had reached for the boy, the way the boy's thin voice had cracked with fear. Don't let him take me. He wondered now if the shadow had been there from the beginning, long before he stepped into the house, long before the intruder ended the boy's life. Perhaps the house itself had collected something darker over the years, something that now hunted anything small and unguarded, and yet the boy's shadow hadn't vanished. It had reached for him, pleaded with him, demanded he take it away. John stared at the notes spread across his kitchen table, at the photograph of the boy smiling with his toy robot in hand. He wanted to believe he had failed, that the boy was still there, clinging to the walls of the Miller Street house. That would have been simple, contained. But each time he shifted in his chair, each time he caught sight of his own reflection in the window, the truth pressed harder against his chest. His shadow didn't look right anymore. At first it had been subtle, an arm bent at a fractionally wrong angle, a head tilted as though listening to someone else. But now, in the late hours when the lamplight cast his outline clear against the wall, he could see the distortion plainly. His arms stretched longer than they should, his shoulders sloped as if bent beneath a weight, and sometimes when he moved, the shadow did not follow right away. He found himself whispering into the empty room. "Are you there?" Silence. Then faintly, just beneath the hum of the refrigerator, just beneath the creak of the floorboards, "Help me." John pressed his palms against his eyes, his chest heavy, his breath shaking. He wanted to tell himself it was only memory, only imagination. But when he pulled his hands away, the shadow on the wall was no longer sitting with him. It was standing, tall and crooked, its head tilted at that impossible angle. He didn't move. Couldn't. The whisper came again, this time softer, almost tender. "Take me with you." Weeks passed. John did not return to Miller Street. He told his supervisor he had closed the job, filed the paperwork neatly, and no one asked questions. The house was just another property in the city's neglected ledger, left to rot until some developer bought the land. He tried to return to normal assignments, to ordinary inspections, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. In every building, every room, he found himself watching the walls more closely than the floors, the shadows more closely than the objects casting them. And every so often the boy appeared again, not fully, not as he had on that first night, crouched over his toy. Just a flicker, a small hand at the edge of the wall, a head turning at the corner of his vision. Sometimes, when John stood in an empty room, he heard the faint click of the robot's plastic limbs, the scrape of its stiff feet against the floor. He spoke less to his coworkers, avoided eye contact, drifted further into himself, and though no one else noticed, he knew. He knew he no longer walked alone, because shadows do not lie. They never had, and his shadow was no longer his own. The red eyes. Lily had never thought much about old dormitories. She had grown up in a neat suburban house with walls that had been painted too often to remember, a house that had never known a century of students pressing their laughter and grief into its plaster. When she was assigned to the east wing of the university's oldest residence hall, She accepted without protest, telling herself that the age of a building meant nothing so long as it kept out the rain and gave her a place to sleep. The hall had been built in the late 1800s, red brick weathered to dull brown, windows narrow and tall like watchful eyes. When she arrived with her single suitcase and her laptop bag, she felt more like she was walking into a boarding school from some forgotten novel than a modern college dorm. The lobby smelled of old wood and faint detergent, a mix of generations layered on top of one another. The receptionist, a tired woman with a stack of forms on her desk, handed Lily a brass key and told her, with a half smile, "Don't get lost. The halls play tricks." Her room was on the third floor, down a corridor that bent slightly to the left, then again to the right, as if the architect had been drunk or the building had simply sagged with time. The door was painted a shade of white that had yellowed, its number hand-stenciled in black, worn nearly to a blur. Inside, the room was modest. A narrow bed pressed against the wall, a desk under the window, a wardrobe that smelled faintly of mothballs. Dust motes drifted lazily in the last slant of afternoon light. She unpacked slowly, arranging her books on the desk, setting her mug on the shelf. As she worked, she became aware of the sound of voices drifting through the hall, the clatter of other students arriving, the scrape of chairs, the occasional burst of laughter. Normal sounds, comforting in their familiarity. She told herself that by the end of the week, the place would feel less like an antique and more like home. That evening, she joined a few of the other new arrivals in the common room. They sat on cracked leather couches and drank instant coffee out of mismatched mugs, introducing themselves in hesitant waves of conversation. It was there, as the night wore on, that Lily first heard the story. It came from a tall boy with wire-rimmed glasses, spoken casually as though it were simply part of the building's history. "There's a room down the hall, just around the corner from yours," he said, pointing vaguely in the direction of the east wing. "Used to belong to a girl. Years ago. She didn't make it, hung herself in the wardrobe." The words fell into the silence like stones into water. Another girl laughed nervously, waving her hand. "Oh, come on. Every dorm has a ghost story. That one's ancient. No one even knows her name." But the boy only shrugged. "Doesn't matter if you know her name. People say she never left. You'll hear her at night sometimes, crying." Lily rolled her eyes, though quietly. She had no patience for stories told just to spook the new kids. Still, when she walked back to her room later, the corridor felt longer than before, its corners darker, its silence heavier. She fell asleep near midnight, the hum of her laptop fan filling the room. And then she woke. At first she thought it was the wind, a faint sound threading through the old windows, rising and falling like a sigh. But as she lay still, her ears straining, she realized it wasn't wind at all. It was crying, soft, uneven sobs, muffled as though coming from behind a wall. A girl's voice breaking in the quiet. Lily sat up slowly, her heart pressing against her ribs. She turned her head toward the sound. It came from the next room, the one the boy had mentioned. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet cool against the wood floor, and pressed her ear to the wall. The sobs grew clearer. She could hear the catch of breath, the whispered rhythm of someone trying to hold back their grief. "Hello?" she called softly, tapping against the plaster. "Are you okay?" The sobbing stopped. The silence that followed was immense, thick, pressing. Lily waited, her hand against the wall, but no answer came. The next morning she asked about it at breakfast, more curious than afraid. The other girls at her table shook their heads. One of them frowned. "No one lives there. That room's been locked for years." "But I heard," Lily began, then trailed off. Their expressions made her feel foolish. She forced a smile, changed the subject, and told herself she must have been dreaming. But that night, when she turned out the lamp and curled under the thin blanket, the crying came again, soft, desperate, just on the other side of the wall. And this time, when she pressed her ear close, she thought she heard words tangled in the sobs. "Please, don't look at me." Her chest tightened. She backed away from the wall, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her eyes wide in the dark. The sobbing continued for a long time, then faded slowly into silence. When morning came, the corridor outside was bright and ordinary, filled with the sound of doors slamming and students hurrying to class. But the door next to hers remained closed. Its brass knob was tarnished, its lock untouched. and as Lily walked past it, she thought she saw something faint, something red, glinting in the shadow beneath the crack. The second night came with rain. It pattered against the tall windows, rattled in the old frames, and dripped steadily through the gutter just outside Lily's room. She told herself the rain would drown out anything strange, would blanket her in ordinary sound, the kind she had always found soothing. She brewed weak tea in the dented kettle provided by the dorm, curled up at her desk with her notes, and studied until her eyes blurred. When at last she slid under the blanket, she felt almost at peace. But just as her breathing began to steady, the crying returned. It rose faintly at first, threading through the hiss of rain, then grew sharper, as though the storm outside had made the walls thinner. The sobs quivered, broken, each one followed by a long silence that carried more weight than the sound itself. Lily sat up, her stomach tightening. "No," she whispered into the dark. "Not tonight. I'm not listening." She pressed a pillow over her ears, squeezed her eyes shut. But the sound slipped through the fabric, lodged itself in her chest. It was different this time. Closer, the words clearer. "Don't look." Lily shivered violently and pushed the pillow aside. She lit her desk lamp, flooding the room with weak yellow light. The sobbing faded as the bulb warmed, as though the voice could not survive the glow. She sat in the light until dawn, trembling, her textbook spread around her like a shield. By the third night, she was exhausted. Her classes blurred together. Her notes became a jumble of half-written sentences. When a classmate asked if she was sick, she nearly said yes. But she couldn't explain the real sickness, the weight of dread that coiled in her chest each evening, the way she dreaded the hush of midnight. That night she heard not crying, but knocking. 3 soft raps against the wall. Paused. Then again. She sat stiff in bed, clutching her blanket, staring at the wall. She whispered, "Who is it?" before she could stop herself. Silence. Her desk lamp flickered once, dimmed, then steadied. She told herself it was old wiring, told herself the storm the night before had unsettled the circuits. But when she glanced at the wall again, she thought she saw something faint. A shimmer of red beneath the crack of the locked door next to hers, just a trace, gone before she could be sure. The next morning she searched her own room with sudden purpose, as though order might protect her. She pulled the wardrobe away from the wall, swept dust from beneath the bed, pried open the desk drawers. It was when she ran her fingers along the underside of the desk that she felt it. Cold metal, wedged deep in a crack where the wood had splintered. She pulled it free. A key, old brass, dulled by years, heavy in her hand. Its bow was ornate, its shaft thin, its teeth jagged with age. She turned it over slowly, her pulse pounding. It did not belong to any of the new locks in the dorm. It belonged to something older, something forgotten. Her gaze shifted toward the door next to hers. The locked room. She placed the key on her desk and stared at it for a long time, her chest tight. She told herself it meant nothing, just a leftover piece of history, a lost item from some student decades before. But deep inside, she knew. She knew the key was meant for her. That night, she tried not to sleep. She sat at her desk, the key beside her lamp, and studied until her eyes burned. Midnight came and passed. 1 o'clock. 2. Her vision swam. And then, softly, the sobbing began again. She froze, her pen trembling in her hand. "Please, don't look at me." She pressed her palms against her ears, rocking slightly in her chair. But the voice threaded through her body now, not just her ears. It was inside her head, inside her chest. The key vibrated faintly against the desk. Lily gasped and pulled her hands away, staring at it. The sobbing grew louder. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" Silence. Then the knock. 3 soft raps against the wall. The key slid half an inch across the wood. Her breath caught. She shoved her chair back, her knees colliding with the bed. The lamp flickered. The sobbing surged. She grabbed the key with trembling fingers and shoved it into the drawer, slamming it shut. The sobbing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. The following day, she walked the halls in a daze, watching the other students laugh and complain and spill coffee on their notebooks. None of them seemed to notice the heavy air of the east wing, the way the corridor bent oddly near the locked door, the way the floor creaked more there than anywhere else. She wondered if she was the only one who heard, the only one who felt it. When she returned to her room that evening, The key lay neatly in the center of her desk. She hadn't touched it. She tried to sleep with the blanket pulled over her head, but the air beneath it grew too hot, too thin. She pushed it aside and stared at the ceiling until her vision blurred. And then the crying began again. Softer this time. Almost gentle. Almost familiar. "Don't. Look at me." Lily turned her head slowly toward the wall. Her body rigid. Her eyes widened. The key was glowing faintly red. And the sobbing came not only from the other room. It came from inside her own. For 2 nights, Lily kept the key shut in her drawer, as though distance alone could rob it of its weight. She told herself she would hand it to the hall director, that she would explain she'd found it and have nothing more to do with it, but she never quite managed to pick it up during the day. The hours slipped away between lectures and library visits, and when she returned each evening, it was waiting for her again, gleaming faintly in the lamplight, lying not in the drawer but in the open center of her desk, as though someone had placed it there while she was gone. On the 3rd night she gave in. The sobbing had been constant, rising each evening with the same rhythm, each word seeping through the wall like damp. "Don't look at me." The voice had become part of her breathing, part of her pulse. She knew she would never sleep until she saw what lay beyond that locked door. So just past midnight she slipped her fingers around the brass, cold and heavy, and stepped into the corridor. The dorm was silent, too silent. Even at that hour there was usually the thump of music somewhere, the shuffle of feet, the muted laughter of students who lived more boldly than she did. Tonight there was nothing but the creak of old wood and the faint hiss of the radiator. The hall stretched long and dim, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. The door waited. Its paint was chipped, its number plate missing. Dust crusted the knob, and cobwebs lined the corners. No one had touched it in years. Her hand shook as she lifted the key. The brass slid into the lock with a weighty, inevitable click, as though it had always belonged there. She turned it slowly. The tumblers groaned, then yielded. The sobbing stopped. The silence pressed hard against her ears, and for a moment she thought the air itself had frozen. Then the knob turned beneath her fingers. The door swung inward with a long, aching creak. The smell hit her first. Dust, stale perfume, and something sour beneath, like old tears absorbed by fabric long forgotten. She lifted her phone, the dim glow of its flashlight spreading across the room. It was small, nearly identical to her own, but untouched since another lifetime. A narrow bed, sheets yellowed with age, a desk with notebooks still stacked neatly, a wardrobe half open with clothes hanging limp and gray. The air shimmered faintly with dust stirred by her entrance, and for a moment it felt like stepping into a photograph, a moment preserved in amber. Her breath came shallow. She stepped inside. The floor creaked softly under her weight, each sound unnaturally loud. She swept the beam of light across the desk, saw a framed picture turned face down, its glass cracked. The wardrobe door moved slightly as the air shifted, groaning on its old hinges, and then she heard it. "Don't look at me." Her heart seized. The voice came from the corner, low and ragged, trembling with despair. She turned slowly, her light shaking. There she was, a girl. Long hair spilling like a curtain over her face, her white nightgown stained yellow with age, her body rigid in the farthest corner of the room. She stood with her back pressed to the wall, her head tilted down, her hands covering her face. "Don't look at me." The words broke, half sob, half command. Lily's breath rattled in her throat. She wanted to speak, to say she was sorry, that she hadn't meant to intrude, but the words died on her lips. Her legs felt heavy, her skin prickled cold, her vision narrowing to the trembling outline in the corner. The girl did not move except for the shudder of her shoulders, as though every breath cost her. Her fingers clutched her own face with such force that her knuckles gleamed bone white. "Don't look." Lily stumbled backward, her shoulder striking the desk, the picture frame clattering to the floor. She gasped, the sound sharp in the thick air, and the girl flinched at the noise, her head twitching slightly but her hands never falling. The silence after was unbearable. Lily forced herself to step back toward the door, her body trembling, her chest tight. She whispered, "I'll go. I'm sorry. I'll go." She reached for the knob with shaking fingers. The door did not move. She twisted harder, the old brass rattling in its frame. Nothing. She turned back, her phone beam sweeping desperately. The girl was still in the corner, Her hands clamped to her face, but her head had lifted slightly, tilting toward Lily, as though listening. "Don't look at me." Her voice was softer now, almost pleading, almost gentle. Lily pressed her back to the door, tears pricking her eyes. She whispered, "I won't. I promise I won't." But the air had changed. Heavier, closer. The shadows in the corners seemed to crawl, pressing tighter around the walls. The wardrobe groaned, its door inching open wider, though no hand touched it. The sheets on the bed shifted faintly, as if stirred by breath. And in the dim light of her phone, Lily saw the faintest glimmer of red leaking through the girl's fingers. 2 small points, burning. Her stomach turned, her chest locked. The girl trembled, her hair swaying as her head tilted further upward. "Don't look." The words were no longer command, but inevitability. Lily pressed herself against the door, clawing at the knob, her breath tearing from her throat. The girl's shoulders rose and fell with shallow, jagged sobs. Her fingers loosened slightly, just enough for Lily to see a glimpse of skin, pale and slick with tears. And beneath the curtain of hair, the red glow burned brighter. The red glow seeping through the girl's fingers pulsed faintly, as though each tremor of her sobs set the light throbbing. Lily's stomach clenched, her knees weak. She could not look away, yet every part of her screamed too. She dragged her eyes to the door, clawed again at the brass knob, but it refused to turn. It rattled loosely in her hand, taunting her with the sound of motion, but the wood itself felt sealed, as if the frame had swollen with the weight of the house pressing inward. The girl in the corner shuddered, her hands clamped tighter to her face for a moment, then loosened again, fingers trembling. The whisper returned, hoarse, ragged, drawn out. "Don't look at me." Lily's voice broke. "I'm not. I won't. Just let me out, please." The only answer was the scrape of the wardrobe's hinges as the door creaked wider. Inside, the clothes swayed though no wind touched them, their limp sleeves lifting as if stirred by unseen hands. Dust floated in the air, thick and slow, each particle catching the faint red shimmer. The sheets on the bed shifted again, indenting slightly, as though something unseen had sat down. The girl moved. It was slight, just the lift of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, but her feet scraped softly against the floor, the first sound of her body breaking the silence. Lily's breath caught sharp in her chest. Her phone trembled in her grip, the beam of light shaking wildly across the room. The glow behind the girl's fingers flared brighter, bleeding through the cracks, painting her pale hands crimson. Lily pressed herself against the door, heart hammering, tears rising hot behind her eyes. She whispered again, desperate, "I don't want to see. I don't want to look. Please." The girl took one step forward. The sound of her bare foot against the wood was soft but immense, echoing in the tiny room until it filled Lily's skull. The girl's hair fell in long strands across her hands, damp and tangled, clinging to her wrists. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and yet she moved inexorably closer, as though dragged forward by something beyond her will. "Don't look at me." The plea now carried a crack, a shiver of despair, but also inevitability. It was no longer only a warning. It was a confession. Lily stumbled sideways along the door, her shoulders scraping the wall, her breath ragged. She lifted the phone higher, the beam grazing the girl's hair. The strands glistened wet, catching the light, clinging to her arms. Her fingers twitched as though struggling, wanting to hold tighter, wanting to let go. Another step. The floorboards creaked. The space between them shrank. Lily's chest seized. She darted toward the desk, nearly tripping over the fallen picture frame. Her light swept across the walls, across the wardrobe yawning wide, across the bed sagging under unseen weight. She pressed herself into the corner, as far as she could retreat, her back colliding with the plaster. The girl sobbed louder, her words breaking apart, spilling into the air like blood into water. Don't look at me." Her hands trembled violently. The glow between her fingers surged bright, staining her hair red, painting her gown with streaks like wounds. Lily covered her mouth with her free hand, biting down hard on her palm to keep from screaming. Her whole body shook, her legs refusing to move, as though the very air had thickened into chains. The girl took another step. Now the distance between them was only the width of the narrow bed. Her sobbing filled the space, her shoulders rising and falling in violent tremors. The wardrobe groaned wider behind her, its clothes twisting, swaying as if pulled by invisible tides. The sheets on the bed sank deeper, pressed by weight Lily could not see. The room seemed to close in, its air burning hot, its corners crawling with shadow. Lily whispered again, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'll leave. I swear. Please, let me leave." The girl stopped, her hands clamped hard against her face once more, knuckles white, nails digging into her own skin. The red glow dimmed slightly, pulsing like a heart, struggling. For a moment, Lily thought hope that she would retreat, would sink back into the corner and vanish into shadow. Then the voice came again. "You already looked?" The words hit like a stone. Lily's knees buckled. She had seen it. Even if only a flicker, even if only through trembling fingers, she had seen the glint of red. The girl lowered her hands just slightly, and the glow flared brighter. Lily screamed, the sound torn raw from her throat. She darted toward the door, clawing at the knob, shoving her shoulder against the wood. The frame shook, but the door held firm, sealed as though nailed shut from the other side. She pounded against it with her fists, her sobs mingling with her screams. "Help me, somebody." The hall outside remained silent. Behind her, the girl's sobbing stopped. Lily froze. The silence pressed down, heavier than any cry. She turned slowly, dread pressing like ice through her chest. The girl no longer covered her face. Her arms hung at her sides, trembling. Her hair fell in wet strands, framing her face. The red glow burned clear now, twin points searing through the gloom. "Her eyes. Yes, William. Blood-red eyes." The girl's lips parted. Her voice was steady now, cold and low. "Don't look at me, because once you do..." She stepped forward, closing the distance in 2 silent strides. "You can never look away." The red light flared, filling the room, swallowing Lily's vision, and the door behind her slammed shut. The red light swallowed everything. It wasn't like ordinary light, not the sterile beam of her phone or the warm flicker of a lamp. It burned without warmth, seared without brightness, saturating the air until every surface glowed with the hue of fresh wounds. Lily staggered back against the sealed door, her palms flat against the wood, her chest heaving as though the glow itself was pressing the breath out of her lungs. The girl stood only a few feet away. Her hair hung damp and heavy, strands clinging to her hollow cheeks. Her nightgown clung too, spotted with dark stains that pulsed faintly in the light. But her eyes were no longer hidden. They stared straight into Lily's, wide and unblinking, the white swallowed by red, the pupils black and bottomless. Tears streamed from them, thick and endless, but even as they fell, they glowed like coals. Each drop that struck the floor hissed faintly, leaving tiny dark stains on the warped wood. Lily tried to look away. She forced her head toward the corner, toward the wardrobe, toward anywhere but those eyes. But her neck froze, her muscles locked, and her gaze snapped back as if tethered by invisible strings. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The girl's lips moved, slow and deliberate, her voice steady now, no longer sobbing, no longer trembling. "You saw me. You shouldn't have. Now you carry it too." Lily shook her head violently, tears burning down her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she choked out, "No, I didn't want to. I didn't." The girl stepped closer. The floor groaned under her bare feet, each step leaving behind a faint red print that glowed before fading. She lifted one trembling hand, her fingers pale and thin, and reached toward Lily's face. Lily tried to flinch away, but her body refused her. The air was thick, glue-like, pinning her to the door. The girl's fingertip touched her cheek. It burned cold, colder than ice, and yet it seared deeper than flame. Lily gasped, her vision shuddering. "You will see what I see," the girl whispered. "You will never close your eyes again." Lily felt the cold spread through her skin, down her jaw, behind her eyes. She screamed, her hands clawing at the air, but no sound escaped. The girl's touch pressed harder, dragging across her cheekbone, across the corner of her eye. The red glow flared brighter, blinding, until Lily could see nothing else, and then darkness. When Lily woke, she was lying on the floor of her own room. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, weak and gray. Her phone lay beside her, its battery dead. The door to the neighboring room was shut tight, its lock gleaming brass, as though it had never been opened. For a long time she lay still, her breath shallow, her chest heavy. She told herself it had been a dream, a night terror born of exhaustion and suggestion. She told herself she had never touched the key, never turned it in the lock, never stepped into the room. But when she pushed herself upright, her body trembling, she saw it, on her cheek, a faint red mark, like the trail of a fingertip. Her stomach lurched. She stumbled to the mirror above her desk, bracing herself on the wood as she leaned close. Her reflection stared back, pale skin, wide eyes rimmed with dark circles from sleepless nights. For a moment, relief. And then, as the light shifted, her pupils shimmered. Just for an instant, the whites of her eyes flushed red, glowing faintly in the glass. She staggered back, her breath tearing out of her throat. But when she looked again, they were normal, dark and tired. Nothing more. She clutched the edge of the desk, whispering to herself, "It's nothing. It's nothing." But deep down, she knew. She moved out of the dorm within the month, claiming personal reasons, transferring to a newer residence across campus. She packed her belongings quickly, refusing to glance at the door next to hers. She left the key behind, laying it on the center of her desk as she closed the door for the last time. In the new dormitory, the walls were white and clean, the halls straight, the doors freshly painted. She told herself she was safe now. But at night, in the silence between breaths, she still heard it, soft crying muffled just behind the wall. "Don't look at me." She pressed her hands to her ears, pulled the blanket tight, but the sound threaded through her body, filling her chest, her throat. And when she dared look in the mirror again, when the room was darkest and she was most afraid, she sometimes saw it, her own reflection, staring back with eyes that glowed faintly red. Lily never spoke of it to anyone. She went to her classes, handed in her papers, smiled when she had to, but the sleeplessness deepened. Her eyes grew hollow, and always, she avoided mirrors when she could, because the girl's voice still lived inside her, whispering soft and steady, long after she had left that old dormitory behind. "Now you have red eyes, too." And the worst part, the part Lily would never say aloud, was that sometimes, when she closed her eyes at night, she no longer saw darkness. She saw everything the girl had seen, the wardrobe, the rope, the last moment of light before it all went out. And she woke each morning with her cheeks wet, her pillow damp with tears that burned faintly red in the dawn. Blood wine. David had always thought of wine as a kind of memory bottle. He spoke of vintages as though they were years captured in amber, grapes pressed into liquid history. In his climate-controlled cellar, beneath the polished floors of his townhouse, he kept row upon row of dark bottles whose labels whispered of regions and decades that most people only read about in books. Burgundy, Bordeaux, Barolo. He spoke of them reverently to the rare friends he trusted enough to show his collection, his voice taking on the cadence of prayer. To him, wine was not a drink. It was a ghost. It was inevitable that he would become obsessed with rumors. That was how he came to blood wine. The first time he heard the name, it was in passing, during a dinner hosted by another collector. The man had been pouring a Montrachet, the cork crumbling slightly under his hand, when someone laughed about the vintages you'll never see, and a guest, half drunk, had leaned close to David and whispered, "There is one you won't find in any cellar, no matter how deep you dig. They call it blood wine." The guest had laughed after, dismissing it as folklore, but the name stuck in David's mind. He rolled it around in his thoughts for weeks. Blood wine. The words had a gravity to them, an inevitability, as though they had been waiting for him all along. By the time autumn came, he was no longer content with rumor. He began asking questions, quietly at first, among other collectors, then more directly, with merchants whose shops smelled of cork and dust. Most shook their heads, claimed ignorance. A few gave him sharp looks, as though he had spoken something forbidden. Finally, he found someone who did not laugh. It was late, a wet evening in the city, when he stumbled across a narrow alley that smelled faintly of mildew and oak. At the end of it, between shuttered storefronts, was a wine shop so old its sign had nearly faded from view. He had never noticed it before, though he had walked the district countless times. A bell tinkled as he pushed the door. Inside was dim, the air thick with the mingled perfume of cork, varnish, and something metallic beneath. Wooden racks bowed with the weight of bottles whose labels had long yellowed. A single lamp glowed behind the counter, where an older woman sat with a ledger open before her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes sharp, too clear for her years. "You're late," she said softly, as though she had expected him. David smiled uneasily, brushing rain from his coat. "I didn't realize you closed." "We never close," she said and shut the ledger. "What are you looking for?" He hesitated, then let the words fall. "Blood wine." The woman did not laugh. She did not frown. She only studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrow, the silence filling with the tick of a clock he could not see. Then she rose from her chair, her joints creaking, and walked toward the far wall. "You collectors," she said, her voice low, "always hungry for more. You think the rarest bottle will give you immortality, that the next vintage will finally taste like eternity." She reached for a shelf, pulled down a bottle so dust-laden it looked carved from stone. She placed it on the counter, but did not remove the cork. "Blood wine is not made for collectors." David leaned forward, his hands trembling faintly. "Then who is it made for?" The woman's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "For those who do not ask, for those who inherit it by accident or by curse." She tapped the bottle, the sound dull. "It is not from a vineyard you will find on a map. The grapes are not nourished by soil alone. Do you understand me?" He swallowed, his throat dry. "You mean blood?" She did not answer. She only ran her finger along the neck of the bottle, her nail leaving a faint scratch. "Once in a century," she said softly, "when the season is right, when the land is willing, that is when it is made. A vintage that costs more than you would ever be willing to pay." David's heart raced. He wanted to ask where, how, who, but her eyes silenced him. "Leave it alone," she said. "There are vintages you are not meant to taste." He tried to press her, but she turned away, returned to her ledger, and would not speak another word. The conversation was finished. Yet, it was only beginning for him. He left the shop with the name burning hotter than ever in his mind. Blood wine. He could almost taste it, though he had never lifted such a bottle to his lips. In his imagination, it was darker than any Bordeaux, heavier than any Shiraz, a liquid that clung to the tongue like confession. He dreamed of it that night, dreamed of a glass that glowed faintly red in the dark, a glass he could not empty no matter how much he drank. He woke with his throat parched, his body shaking. The obsession had rooted itself in him. He knew he would not rest until he found it. So he began again, digging deeper. He found a mention in an obscure French text, half folkloric, half agricultural, about a vineyard in the south where the vines were watered with sacrifice. He traced it through maps, narrowing the possible region to a cluster of villages near the Pyrenees. Each reference was vague, couched in rumor, but together they pointed like crooked fingers to one place. By the end of the month, he had booked a flight. On the day of his departure, he descended into his cellar one last time. The rows of bottles gleamed in the dim light, each a treasure, each a story. He ran his hand along their necks, whispering the vintages like names of old lovers, but none of them stirred him now. They were hollow, ordinary. He had already moved beyond them. He poured himself a glass of a rare Burgundy, one he had once sworn he would never touch, and drank it down without ceremony. It tasted thin, empty, as though even the greatest wines had lost their voice. All that remained was the echo of the woman's words, a vintage that costs more than you would ever be willing to pay. And as the plane lifted him across the sea, David smiled faintly to himself. He was willing to pay anything. The countryside unfurled beneath the train like a painting left too long in the Sunday. Fields stretched toward the horizon in muted greens and browns, their edges blurred by mist, their lines uneven where walls had crumbled and hedgerows gone wild. David pressed his forehead to the glass, watching vineyards roll past in waves, their vines brittle, their leaves curling at the edges with the fatigue of late autumn. He told himself he was searching for a single vineyard, but the truth pressed harder against him with each mile. He was searching for a wound, something old and half-healed, something that still bled when pressed. The train rattled into a small station near the Pyrenees, little more than a platform of cracked stone and a squat building with shuttered windows. A faded sign bore the village's name, the paint peeling until it was almost unreadable. When he stepped onto the platform, the air smelled faintly of earth and smoke, sharper than the city air he was used to, and colder, as though the mountains themselves had breathed down his neck. There was no taxi stand, no cluster of waiting cars. just a narrow road that wound between stone cottages and vanished into hills that seemed to fold endlessly upon themselves. David shouldered his bag and walked, his footsteps echoing in streets that were too quiet for midday. He saw only a few faces, lined and guarded, peering from doorways or leaning in shadowed alleys. When he asked about accommodations, most shrugged or pretended not to understand his French. Finally, an innkeeper with cloudy eyes gave him a room at the top of a creaking staircase, a room that smelled faintly of vinegar and damp wood. That evening he sat in the inn's small bar, sipping the local red. It was coarse, heavy, with a metallic edge that lingered unpleasantly on his tongue. He tried to make conversation with the barkeep, a stooped man who seemed older than the wood he polished. But when David mentioned wine collecting, the man only gave him a thin smile. When David pressed further, whispering the name blood wine as though it might unlock something, the man's hand froze on the glass he was drying. "You don't want that," he said quietly, and walked away. David sat in the silence, the bad wine souring in his mouth. The next day, he walked the hills. The vineyards here looked abandoned, their rows tangled with weeds, their trellises broken. He stepped carefully through the cracked soil, running his hand along brittle vines that no longer bore fruit. The land smelled faintly of rust and rain, though the sky was clear. His shoes picked up dust that clung red to the leather, staining them as though he had walked through something that was not earth at all. By mid-afternoon, as the sun lowered behind the folds of the hills, he saw her. She stood near the edge of a collapsed stone wall, her hair pulled back loosely, her dress plain but clean. She watched him with eyes too calm for a stranger, as though she had expected him. "You are far from the station," she said in accented English. David hesitated, brushing dirt from his hands. "I'm looking for a vineyard," he said carefully. "One that's unusual." The faintest smile touched her lips. "There are many unusual vineyards here, most of them dead." He swallowed, then spoke the words that had carried him across an ocean. "They call it blood wine." The air between them shifted, colder, heavier. The girl's eyes flickered, not with surprise but with recognition. She stepped closer, the red dust clinging to the hem of her dress. "People in the village don't speak of it," she said. "They are afraid. They say the vines drink more than rain." David's heart raced. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Do you know where?" For a long moment she studied him, her face unreadable. Then she nodded. "Once. Yes, I can take you." The relief that washed over him was sharp, almost painful. "Thank you," he whispered. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "You should not thank me yet." She led him along narrow paths that wound through the hills, paths that seemed older than the villages themselves, carved by feet long gone. The air grew heavier as they walked, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their steps and the occasional call of a crow circling above. The sun dipped lower, throwing their shadows long across the path. David's legs ached, but he did not complain. As dusk settled, they reached the edge of a ruined estate. Stone walls crumbled inward, ivy choking what remained of a grand house. The iron gate hung crooked on its hinges, its bars rusted, streaked with something darker beneath. Beyond the gate, vines sprawled wild and unchecked, their leaves dark, their grapes heavy and strangely luminous in the fading light. David's breath caught. He had never seen grapes so dark, their skins almost black, yet glistening faintly as though wet. The air was thick with the scent of fruit, but beneath it was another odor, metallic and sharp, like copper coins held too long in the mouth. The girl stopped at the gate, her hand resting lightly on the rusted iron. "This is the place," she said softly. David stared past her at the sprawling ruin, his heart hammering. "And the wine?" Her eyes flicked to his, calm and unreadable. "If you want to taste it, you must go inside." And he glanced at the crumbling walls, at the vines crawling like veins across the stone. His throat tightened. "Will you come with me?" She tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "I will show you the way, that is all." They entered as the last of the light bled from the sky. The iron gate screeched as it opened, the sound sharp enough to set David's teeth on edge. The path beyond was overgrown, the stones cracked and uneven. Grapes hung heavy on twisted vines, their skins splitting, staining the ground beneath with dark streaks. David crouched briefly, touching the soil, and his fingers came away red. The girl's voice broke the silence. "Do you still wish to see?" David looked at his hand, at the stain that looked too much like blood, and swallowed hard. Yes, she nodded once and led him toward the house. Its windows were shattered, its roof sagging, but the door still stood, dark wood swollen with age. As she pushed it open, the smell of oak and rot poured out, heavy with the sweetness of grapes, and beneath it again that metallic tang. Sharper now, unmistakable. David hesitated on the threshold, his heart pounding. The air inside seemed thicker, damp, as though the house itself had been breathing for centuries. He glanced at the girl, but her expression remained calm, almost serene. "Go," she said quietly, and with trembling legs he stepped into the house where blood wine was made. The door gave way under his hand with a reluctant groan, as though the wood itself had not been touched in years, perhaps decades, and resented his intrusion. The air that escaped was not the stale emptiness of an abandoned house. It was thick, moist, tinged with an odor he could not immediately place. At first it seemed like the heady sweetness of grapes left too long to ferment, but beneath it copper, a tang that made his tongue prickle and the back of his throat tighten. David drew in a careful breath and stepped across the threshold. The girl remained just behind him, her presence neither guiding nor warning, simply watching. He could not shake the feeling that she had walked this way many times before, though she looked barely old enough to know the century-old stories this place must hold. The hall was narrow, lined with peeling plaster. Fragments of old wallpaper clung in strips, their patterns faded to ghostly outlines of once bright flowers. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred by his movements, catching in his throat. The floor sagged under his weight, groaning with each step. He kept his hand near the wall for balance, his palm dragging across grit and cobwebs. The house seemed to breathe. He told himself it was only drafts, the wind pushing through broken shutters, but the rhythm of it unsettled him. The air came and went in slow, steady pulses, as if drawn into invisible lungs and expelled again. The scent of fruit and metal grew stronger with each breath. They passed through a sitting room. Chairs, rotted and sagging, faced a cold fireplace. A decayed rug lay in a heap, its pattern barely visible through the stains. On the mantel sat a cluster of bottles, their glass darkened with grime, some cracked, others intact. David brushed one with his fingertips, and the dust crumbled under his touch. The label had long since dissolved, leaving only a faint reddish smear. He turned to the girl. This place was at a vineyard house? Her eyes lingered on the fireplace. Once, long ago. He waited for her to say more, but she only gestured to the far door. The cellar. The stairs descended steeply, carved from stone worn smooth by centuries of use. The air grew cooler as they went down, but not fresher. The scent intensified, wrapping around him, pressing close. It was wine. Yes, oak barrels, fermenting grapes, tannins that pricked the back of the tongue, but there was also something heavier, darker, the unmistakable scent of iron. At the foot of the stairs, the passage opened into a vast cellar. His breath caught. Rows of barrels stretched into the shadows, their wood swollen, their metal bands rusted. Some oozed dark liquid that dripped onto the floor in slow beads, pooling into stains that never seemed to dry. The floor itself was slick under his shoes, sticky in places where his soles clung before releasing with faint pops. David stepped forward, his pulse quickening. It's still here. The wine. The girl's voice was soft, almost lost in the cavernous space. It is always here. And he moved deeper among the barrels, running his hand along their sides. The wood was damp, as though the liquid inside had soaked through, though the barrels were intact. His fingers came away stained red. He brought them to his nose, expecting the sourness of spoiled wine, but the metallic tang made his stomach lurch. He whispered to himself, "It can't be." A sound broke the silence. At first he thought it was the creak of the house settling above them, but then it came again, a low, deliberate thump, like the strike of wood on stone. It reverberated through the cellar, through his chest. Another followed, closer this time, steady as footsteps. David froze. His phone was in his pocket, but he did not reach for its light. The dim glow of a single lantern hanging crooked from a beam painted enough of the cellar to see the barrels and the outline of the far wall. The sound drew nearer, echoing against the stone. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. Silence. Then a reply, low and calm. spoken with the intimacy of someone who had always known his name. "You have found it." The words slid through the cellar like smoke, curling into every shadow, filling every hollow space between barrels. David spun toward the voice, his breath ragged, but saw no one. Only the vast rows stretching into gloom. He swallowed hard. "I came to see, to learn." A soft laugh echoed, humorless, dry. "All who come here say the same. They come to taste, to possess. They never ask what must be given." The girl beside him did not move. Her expression was unchanged, calm, as though the voice belonged to something she expected. David's heart pounded. He backed slightly toward the stairs, but the air itself seemed thicker there, colder, as if the path upward had already closed. From the shadows, the voice came again. "You wanted blood wine. You will have it, but first you must understand." A figure emerged slowly from between the barrels. At first, only the shape of a man, tall, thin, his steps unnaturally even. Then the lantern's dim glow caught his face, pale, gaunt, his skin stretched tight over bones, his eyes gleaming faintly as though lit from within. He wore a stained apron, leather cracked with age, its surface darkened with marks that might have been old wine or something else. His hands were long, his fingers curled as though perpetually holding a stemmed glass. David stumbled back. "Who are you?" The man inclined his head, almost courtly. "The vintner, the keeper of the vintage you seek, the one who has tended it longer than you have lived." His voice was steady, ritualistic, carrying the weight of rehearsed litany. David's mouth was dry. "This wine, what is it?" The vintner's lips curved into the faintest smile. "The harvest of sacrifice, the press of despair. Grapes nourished by more than rain. Oak aged in silence deeper than the grave. This wine remembers. It holds what was given to it. That is why it cannot die." David shook his head, trying to cling to reason. "That's nonsense, folklore." The vintner's eyes glowed faintly brighter. "Then taste, and tell me it is not true." He reached toward one of the barrels. His hand rested lightly on the wood, and the surface shuddered beneath his touch, as though something inside moved. David's stomach turned. His legs screamed to flee, but his body would not obey. The cellar itself seemed to hold him. The girl's eyes, calm and watchful, lingered on him as though measuring his worth, or his weight. The vintner leaned closer to the barrel, pressing his ear against it. For a moment, silence. Then faint, almost inaudible, a sound came from within. A whisper. David staggered, his breath tearing from him. The vintner smiled. "Do you hear it? The vintage remembers every voice it has taken. Every drop is a prayer. Every glass, a confession." He turned back to David, his gaze unblinking. "You have come to join them." The vintner's hand lingered on the barrel, stroking the damp wood as one might soothe an animal. His gaunt face tilted toward David, and though his lips barely moved, his words carried clearly through the cellar, reverberating off the stone until they seemed to come from every direction at once. "You collectors," he said softly, almost fondly. "You worship the bottle, the cork, the label. You imagine you understand devotion, but devotion is not measured in currency or in years cellared. Devotion is measured in sacrifice." David forced himself to speak, though his throat felt raw. What do you mean, sacrifice?" The vintner's eyes gleamed faintly. "The land here is not like other land. Long ago, before these hills were charted, before these villages raised their stones, the earth drank deep. It was not rain that fed it. It was not rivers. It was blood." He tapped the barrel gently, and a dull thud echoed within. Too heavy, too alive. "That is why the vines grow here and nowhere else. They hunger. They remember." David shook his head. "That's not possible. Grapes need soil, sunlight. They need life." The vintner interrupted, his voice sharp, slicing through David's denial, then softer again, almost tender. "And life is richest in its ending. The last breath, the final drop, it seeps into the roots. It swells the fruit until it bursts with sweetness. That is the true terroir. That is blood wine." As he spoke, the cellar seemed to tighten around them. The rows of barrels loomed higher, their shadows deepening. Some of them shuddered faintly, their staves creaking as if swollen from within. A slow drip echoed, thick drops falling from somewhere unseen. striking the stone floor with the weight of something far denser than water. David's stomach churned. His collector's curiosity, the thrill that had carried him across continents, shriveled into something darker. Yet still, part of him leaned forward, mesmerized. He whispered, "And people, drink this?" The vintner's smile curved, thin, cold. "They do. They always have. They always will. It is the vintage that lingers on the tongue long after memory fades. A taste of eternity. Those who sip it never forget." He tilted his head, his gaze piercing, and yet they never understand what they consume. They think it is history, myth, romance. They never hear the voices in the glass. David's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to deny it, to walk backward up the stairs and laugh this off as grotesque theater. But the girl still stood by the stairwell, her hands folded neatly before her, her calm expression holding him in place, and the vintner's words threaded into him like roots, impossible to pull free. The vintner moved deeper into the cellar, gesturing for David to follow. Against his better judgment, David obeyed, his shoes sticking faintly to the damp stone as he walked. They passed barrels older than he could fathom, their surfaces swollen, their metal bands warped. Some bore deep scratches, as though something within had tried to claw its way out. At the far end of the cellar stood a barrel larger than all the rest, its wood blackened, its sides bound with chains. The air around it shimmered with heat, though the cellar was cold. A faint hum thrummed from within, low and constant, vibrating through David's chest like the slow beat of a heart. The vintner placed both hands upon it, closing his eyes. "This one," he said softly, "has been aging longer than you have lived. Every year it deepens, every year it darkens. Its voice is louder than the others. Do you wish to hear it?" David shook his head violently. "No, I've heard enough. I need to go." But the vintner only smiled, serene, as though David's protest had been expected. "You sought this place. You asked for it by name. You walked willingly into the vines. There is no leaving without a taste." The girl stepped forward from the shadows, her footsteps soundless on the stone. She carried a small glass, its crystal surface catching the dim lantern glow. She held it out to David, her face expressionless, her eyes unreadable. David stumbled back. "No, I won't. This is madness." The vintner's gaze sharpened, his voice hardening. "Madness? No. This is tradition. This is devotion. This is the only vintage that proves life has meaning." He reached for a tap affixed to the chained barrel. His long fingers curled around the iron, and with a groan that echoed like a cry, he twisted it open. A dark liquid spilled into the glass. It was thicker than wine should be, almost sluggish, clinging to the sides. It glistened in the lantern light, black-red, like something drawn from a vein. The scent rose in a wave, rich and metallic, filling the air until David's stomach turned and his knees weakened. The girl extended the glass toward him. David pressed himself against the wall, shaking his head. "No, I won't touch it." The vintner stepped closer, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the stone. His voice lowered, coaxing, hypnotic. "You came across the world for this. You abandoned your collection, your comforts, your reason. Do you think that was accident? No, David. The vintage called you. It calls all who cannot resist the taste of memory. And once it calls, you cannot refuse." The glass trembled in the girl's hand. The liquid within seemed to pulse faintly, as though it had a heartbeat. David's breath came ragged, his vision blurring. He could almost hear it, not just the drip and hum of the cellar, but whispers, faint and desperate, tangled in the air around the glass. They rose and fell like sighs, voices layered upon voices, crying out, pleading, confessing. He clapped his hands to his ears, but the sound was inside him now, vibrating against his bones. The vintner's eyes gleamed brighter. "You see, you hear, you know what it is. There is no leaving untouched. Drink and join them, or refuse and become part of the cask itself. Either way, you will not leave." The girl stepped closer, her arm steady, the glass inches from his lips. The scent was suffocating, metallic sweetness filling his throat, even before the rim touched him. David shook his head weakly, his knees buckling. "Please, I just wanted to taste, to see." The vintner's smile widened, almost kind. "And so you shall, in ways you cannot yet imagine." The cellar throbbed with whispers, The barrels trembled as though restless, eager. Chains rattled softly against the great cask. David pressed his back against the wall, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the swirling, pulsing liquid. He knew then with a clarity sharper than any reason that his journey had already ended. Blood wine had found him, and it would not let him go. The glass hovered before his lips, trembling only slightly in the young woman's steady hand. David pressed himself harder against the damp stone wall, his chest heaving, his mouth dry. The scent of the liquid was unbearable, a sweetness so cloying it seemed to rot the air, undercut by the sharp tang of iron that made his gums ache and his stomach twist. He turned his head violently aside, gasping, but even then the fumes crept into his nostrils, clinging, insinuating themselves as if they had been waiting all along for the warmth of his lungs. "I won't," he rasped, voice breaking. "I won't drink it." The vintner studied him, his pale face serene, his eyes gleaming faintly in the dim lantern glow. "Of course you won't," he said softly, almost indulgently. "Few do. When the truth is placed before them, the mind recoils, the body resists. That is why the choice is not yours to make." David's knees buckled as the girl stepped closer, pressing the glass insistently against his mouth. He jerked his head, the rim grazing his cheek, smearing it with a streak of dark liquid that burned cold where it touched. He spat, gagging, his whole body trembling. The vintner sighed, patient as a tutor correcting a stubborn student. "You came because you desired it. Desire is already consent. The rest is ritual." Ugh. At a gesture, the girl withdrew the glass and slipped it back onto a narrow shelf. Her face was calm, detached, her eyes empty of either pity or malice. David looked at her, desperate, searching for humanity in her stillness. "Why are you doing this? Why help him?" His voice cracked, choked by fear. For the first time, she spoke more than a phrase. Her words were low, almost gentle. "Because someone brought me. Someone always must. That is how the vintage continues. I guide you here, as I was once guided." Her lips pressed into something like sorrow. "This is the only way we leave." David's stomach dropped. "Leave? You mean you're trapped?" But she turned her face away, silent again. The vintner clapped his long hands together once, and the sound echoed unnaturally loud, bouncing off the stone walls. From the shadows at the edges of the cellar came movement, not footsteps exactly, but the scrape of wood, the creak of strained iron. Barrels shuddered, their staves bulging. Chains rattled faintly against the great cask at the far end. Whispers surged, overlapping, a chorus of voices rising in pleading tones that made David's skin crawl. "Help me. Don't forget. Not another drop. Finish what we began." He clutched his head, his ears ringing, but the voices were not outside him. They swarmed inside his skull, filling every hollow, until his own thoughts drowned beneath their weight. He stumbled forward, knees striking the sticky floor, hands pressed to his temples. The vintner stepped behind him, laying one long hand on David's shoulder. The touch was cold, the weight unnatural. He leaned close, his whisper steady, almost tender. "You must understand, David. The vintage does not simply take. It preserves. It remembers. That is why men like you seek it. You crave memory, permanence, eternity, in a glass. You thought you wanted history, but what you truly wanted was to be remembered." David gasped, shaking his head violently. "No, I don't want this. I never." "You always did," the vintner murmured. "That hunger brought you here, and now you will feed it, as countless others have. You will enrich the soil, deepen the roots. In time, others will drink, and they will taste you. You will linger on their tongues. That is eternity." David's stomach twisted. He screamed, a raw, animal sound, and tried to scramble toward the stairs. His hand slipped on the damp stone, leaving smears of red where he caught himself. He surged upward, clawing at the steps, but before he reached the third, the girl was there, her body blocking the way, her calm gaze fixed on him. "You cannot go," she said softly. "No one does." Her hands pressed against his shoulders, surprisingly strong, forcing him backward. He thrashed, cried out, but she was unyielding, her face blank, her eyes distant, as if her body acted on behalf of something older, something greater. The vintner's steps echoed slowly behind him. From the shadows came ropes, rough and damp. drawn by unseen hands. They wound around David's wrists, his ankles, his chest, tightening with each desperate struggle until he could scarcely breathe. He was dragged across the floor toward the great chained barrel. Its hum grew louder as he neared, thrumming like a heartbeat, vibrating through the stone. The air around it shimmered with heat, though the cellar remained cold. The vintner crouched beside him, his gaunt face close, his voice calm. "Do you hear it? It welcomes you already. It knows you," David thrashed, screaming, his voice breaking. "Please, no. I'll leave. I'll never tell. I swear." The vintner shook his head gently, like a father correcting a child. "It is not about silence. It is about devotion. You will give, as all before you have given. That is the only way the vintage endures." He reached for a small knife on the shelf, not a blade of steel, but a curved tool once meant for pruning vines. Its edge rusted, its handle worn smooth by countless hands. He held it lightly, reverently. David sobbed, his body riding against the ropes. "Why me? Why now?" The vintner's smile deepened faintly, his teeth gleaming in the dim glow. "Because you asked. Because you wanted more than you deserved. And because every vintage requires renewal. It has been waiting. You have arrived." The girl knelt by David's head, her expression unreadable. For a moment, just a moment, her lips parted as though she might speak something kind, some final mercy, but instead she whispered, "It will be quick." The vintner raised the blade. David screamed, twisting, his voice breaking in terror. The cellar roared with whispers, surging louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices pleading, weeping, laughing, praying. The barrels shuddered violently, dark liquid seeping from their seams, spreading across the stone like veins. The great cask throbbed, its chains rattling as though straining to contain what pressed within. The blade touched his throat, cold, light, inevitable. The vintner leaned close, his lips brushing David's ear. "Now you will become part of the vintage." And David's final scream tore through the cellar. The blade pressed. The whispers surged into silence, and then nothing but the steady drip of liquid, dark and thick, joining the slow pool already seeping across the floor. When the lantern flickered hours later, the girl stood alone in the cellar beside the vintner. Her hands were red, though she seemed not to notice. The great cask trembled faintly, then stilled, its hum deepening. Satisfied, she set the emptied glass back upon the shelf, her expression unchanged. The vintner smiled faintly, laying his long fingers once more upon the cask. The vintage endures, and somewhere, deep within the oak, a new voice whispered. Weeks later, far from the ruined estate, a merchant in a distant city placed an unlabeled bottle before a wealthy collector. Its glass was dark, its contents nearly black. The merchant said nothing, only slid the bottle forward. The collector lifted it to the light, his pulse quickening at the density, the richness visible even through the glass. When the cork was drawn, the air filled with a scent like no other, heavy, intoxicating, unforgettable. The collector poured. The wine glistened darkly in the glass, clinging thick to the crystal. He raised it to his lips, his hands trembling. The first sip seared his tongue, metallic and sweet, unlike anything he had ever known. His eyes widened. He whispered, almost reverent, "It's unforgettable." He drank again, and in the glass, if one listened closely enough, a voice whispered, "David, red ribbon." The hospital at night was never quiet in the way people imagined. It did not sleep. It breathed. Somewhere above, monitors hummed, pumps sighed, wheels of gurneys rattled down long corridors. Somewhere else, a voice murmured into a phone, or a patient groaned softly in a half-dream. Yet between those sounds lay pockets of silence, and in those silences the building seemed to listen, as though it too had a heartbeat. Grace had worked enough night shifts to know the rhythm. She carried it in her body now, the patience of long hours, the habit of moving softly. Tonight, she and Elena had just finished stabilizing a patient on the 10th floor, a frantic hour of alarms and rushing hands, and now they stood in the elevator, exhausted, heading back down toward the ground level. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly. The metal walls carried the echo of their breathing. Elena leaned against the rail, her eyes heavy, her hair loose from its bun. Grace watched the numbers flicker down, 10, 9, 8. The elevator did not stop at the lobby. Instead, the numbers kept sliding past, through the first floor, into the basement levels. B1, B2. The hum of the machine deepened, a note lower, as though it too knew they were traveling where few chose to go. Elena frowned, pushing off from the rail. Grounds above. Why are we still? Before she could finish, the elevator jolted and came to a stop. The light flickered once, then steadied. The panel above the door read, B3. Grace's stomach tightened. She had worked in this hospital for years, but she avoided this floor whenever possible. Everyone did. The morgue belonged to the dead, and though it was a place of work like any other, at night it carried a weight that no amount of logic could strip away. The doors began to slide open. Cold air seeped in first, sharp enough to prickle the skin. Then came the figure. A girl, young, her hair hanging loose, her face white as porcelain. She wore no gown, no uniform. Her eyes were dark, still, her expression empty. She stood in the doorway without a word, without a sound, as though she had been waiting all along. She took a step forward. Elena's breath caught. Grace's hand moved faster, slamming the panel of buttons, pressing close again and again. The door shuddered, hesitated, then slid shut with a groan of metal. The elevator lurched upward, numbers blinking slowly back to life. For a moment, silence. Only the hum of ascent, the two women staring at the sealed door as though it might open again at any second. Then Elena turned, her voice shaking. What was that? Did you see? Grace's face was pale but steady. She shook her head, not in denial, but in warning. Her voice was low, measured. Don't talk about it. Just remember this. Down there, everybody is tagged before it's stored. On the wrist. Always the wrist. Elena swallowed hard, nodding though she didn't understand. Her hand trembled against her side, and for a moment she thought she still felt the chill of that open doorway against her skin. The elevator carried them upward, but the silence inside was no longer the silence of a hospital night. It was heavier, waiting. The elevator rattled as it rose, the hum steady but too slow, as though each floor resisted their passage. Elena kept her gaze fixed on the seam of the doors, half expecting them to part again, half dreading the pale face that might still be waiting beyond. Her breath came shallow, fogging the metal panel as she leaned against it. Grace stood straighter, arms crossed, her eyes closed as if in prayer. She had the stillness of someone who had seen this before, someone who knew that speaking too much could give shape to what should remain unspoken. Finally, the elevator chimed. The doors opened onto the main floor, where the lights were warmer, the sounds of monitors and footsteps drifting faintly from distant corridors. A janitor pushed a mop bucket down the hall, humming tunelessly, oblivious to the weight that had followed them up from B3. Grace touched Elena's shoulder, her hand firm. You didn't see her. You didn't hear her. Do you understand? Elena nodded quickly, too quickly, her throat dry. I understand. Oh. They walked together down the corridor, their shoes soft against the waxed floor, their shadows stretching under the fluorescent glow. Grace's steps were measured, her face set in calm, but Elena felt her own pace falter, as though something tugged gently at her from behind. She forced herself not to look back. In the staff lounge, the brightness of the vending machine seemed almost unreal. Grace poured water into a paper cup, handed it over, her voice soft but firm. You'll learn. Nights carry things daylight doesn't. You keep your head down, keep moving, and they pass by. Elena sipped, nodding again, though the water did little to steady her. Her hand shook, drops sliding down her wrist, catching on her skin. She wiped them with the edge of her sleeve, then froze. A faint mark lingered where the water had been. Not a bruise, not a cut. A thin line, reddish, encircling her wrist like the trace of something that had been tied there too tightly. Her heart stumbled in her chest. She turned her arm slightly, hiding it from Grace, but the pressure of fabric against her skin only made her more aware. It was not pain exactly, but a weight, a reminder. She rubbed at it with her thumb, but the line remained, faint but unyielding. She tried to focus on Grace's voice, on the hum of the vending machine, on the distant sounds of the hospital night. But her attention kept slipping back to her wrist, to the invisible thread that seemed to pulse there, as though something had claimed her without her noticing. Grace glanced at her, eyes sharp even in fatigue. "You all right?" Elena forced a smile, her arm tucked close to her side. "Just tired." Grace held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Get some rest when you can." Elena nodded again, but the truth coiled tighter in her chest. Rest would not come. Not with that line circling her wrist. Not with the memory of the girl's empty eyes staring through the crack of the elevator doors. And as the night stretched on, Elena began to feel it more clearly, not a mark, not a trick of her mind, but the ghost of a ribbon she could not remove. The hours after midnight were always the longest. The halls thinned, voices quieted, and the building itself seemed to settle into a rhythm of its own breathing low, patient, waiting. Elena moved through that silence, her steps light, her eyes catching on every shadow that stretched too far. She kept her sleeves pulled down now. The line on her wrist had deepened, faint at first, but sharper each time she looked. She told herself it was nothing, a crease from her watch, an irritation from the glove, but the more she rubbed at it, the more it seemed to resist, as though the mark was not on her skin but beneath it, pulsing faintly with her heartbeat. She began to see it when she wasn't looking, a flash of red at the edge of her vision, slipping around a corner, curling against her wrist when her hands were busy. Once, while washing at the sink, she swore she saw a thin ribbon float briefly in the water, brushing her fingers before dissolving into nothing. She jerked her hands back, but the sting of cold lingered long after. Grace noticed her distraction, the way her eyes wandered, the way her hands kept pulling at her sleeves. She said nothing, only gave the occasional steadying glance, the kind that carried more weight than words. But Elena felt the distance growing, as though Grace already knew, and could do nothing to help. By 3 a.m, the hospital was nearly silent. Elena sat at the nurse's station, head in her hands, trying to steady her breathing. The hum of the lights pressed into her ears, louder than usual, as though the building was murmuring. Then she felt it, the vibration under her chair, subtle but steady, like machinery stirring beneath the floor. The morgue. She tried to ignore it, but the sound grew, a dull thudding like metal against concrete, a rhythm, dragging. She thought of the elevator, the cold air, the girl's pale face. Her chest tightened. Elena rose, moving down the hall before she realized she had left her post. The sound was faint, almost hidden under the pulse of the hospital, but she followed it, each step drawing her closer to the stairwell that led down. The door was closed, painted gray, unmarked except for the small placard, "Basement access, authorized, staff only." She stopped there, her hand hovering above the handle. The metal radiated cold, sharp enough to sting her fingertips. She heard it more clearly now, something shifting below. A soft knock, a scrape, a whisper she could almost mistake for her name. Her wrist burned suddenly. She pulled back her sleeve before she could stop herself, and there it was, stark in the fluorescent light, a ribbon, crimson and thin, tied in a perfect bow against her skin. It had not been there a moment ago, yet now it pressed tight, the knot precise, the tails trailing lightly as though caught in a breeze no one else could feel. Her breath caught in her throat. She clawed at it with trembling fingers, but the ribbon did not give. The more she pulled, the tighter it seemed to cinch, biting into her skin with a pressure that was not quite pain but something far worse, possession. From the stairwell, the sound came again, soft and deliberate, as if whoever was down there knew she was listening. Knock, knock. The ribbon pulsed against her wrist in time with the sound. The stairwell door rattled softly, as if a hand pressed against the other side. Elena stood frozen, her breath shallow, her wrist burning with the ribbon that refused to loosen. The fluorescent light above her flickered, humming louder, dimmer, brighter again, like a pulse trying to match her own. She wanted to scream, to call Grace, to run back to the station, but her feet would not move. The door seemed to draw her nearer, its seam breathing cold air into the corridor. A shadow pooled at the threshold. It was not cast by anything visible, only forming there, thick and dark, spreading upward against the doorframe. It stretched like smoke until it hinted at the outline of a figure, narrow shoulders, long hair falling in heavy strands, a face obscured but waiting. Elena. The voice was not sound. It bloomed directly in her chest, hollow and steady, carrying the weight of something that had spoken too many times from too far away. The ribbon at her wrist tightened, the knot pulling itself tighter, making her fingers numb. She pressed her back against the wall, shaking her head, whispering words that had no strength. No, no, this isn't real. But the shadow leaned closer. The door shuddered. Your place is below. Her knees weakened. She slid halfway down the wall, clutching her wrist as though she could tear the ribbon free with sheer will. Her vision blurred, black edging into the corners. That was when Grace appeared at the far end of the hall. Elena. The sound of her voice cut through the hum, through the pull of the stairwell. Grace's shoes struck sharp against the floor as she rushed forward. She grabbed Elena by the shoulders, shaking her back to awareness. The shadow froze, retreating a fraction, as if the presence of another had disrupted the claim. Grace's eyes dropped to Elena's wrist. For a moment she said nothing, only stared, her mouth tightening, as though confirming something she had dreaded. The red ribbon was visible now, not just to Elena but to both of them, gleaming faintly under the light. The bow was neat, the knot impossible. Grace's face went pale. She whispered, almost too low to hear, "It chose you." Elena shook her head wildly. "Take it off, please. Help me." Grace tried. Her fingers tugged, pulled, clawed at the ribbon, but it did not give. The more she struggled, the deeper the red seemed to sink into the skin, as though it were part of Elena now. The stairwell door rattled again, harder this time, the handle twitching once, twice, metal groaning under pressure. The shadow pressed against the seam, stretching thin, almost ready to spill into the hall. Grace pulled Elena to her feet, her voice firm though her hands trembled. "Don't look at it. Don't answer it. If you give it your eyes, it takes everything else." Elena clung to her, fighting to keep her gaze fixed anywhere but the door. Yet even as she tried, the ribbon pulsed, tugging faintly toward the stairwell, guiding her like a leash. Her arm jerked once, against her will, a step forward before Grace held her tighter. The corridor seemed to bend, the air pressing heavier, the light dimming, and in that thickening dark, the shape at the door became clearer, a young girl's face, pale and still, lips curved in a faint, unnatural smile. Grace's breath caught. She had seen her before, not in life but in the records of the morgue. A name on a tag, a wrist bound with red. The door groaned open by an inch, the cold surging through. The door shuddered, metal groaning as if the weight of the figure beyond was more than the frame could hold. Cold seeped into the corridor, not a draft but a presence, a silence heavy enough to press against the lungs. Grace gripped Elena tighter, whispering words she wasn't sure had power anymore. "Don't look, don't let it in." But Elena was no longer fighting. Her trembling had stilled into something worse, an eerie calm, her breath shallow, her eyes glassy, as though the weight of exhaustion had tipped her into surrender. Slowly, almost dreamlike, she raised her hand. The ribbon gleamed. Under the harsh fluorescent light, it looked impossibly vivid, red sinking into her skin as if it had grown there, a living vein pulsing with each beat of her heart. The bow was neat, perfect, unyielding. Elena lifted her wrist higher, the motion deliberate, her gaze locked, not on Grace, but on the sliver of darkness widening at the stairwell door. Grace's throat tightened. "No, don't show it to her." The words came out too late. The girl's pale face was visible now, pressing through the gap in the door, her hair spilling forward like water. Her eyes were empty, her lips curved into a smile that was not human in its stillness. She did not step into the hall. She didn't need to. She only looked at the ribbon, and that was enough. Elena's arm hung suspended in the air, as though offering herself, and the ribbon seemed to pulse in recognition, the tails fluttering faintly though there was no wind. Grace reached for her, but the air between them felt thicker, harder to cut through, as if invisible hands held her back. "Elena, listen to me," she pleaded, voice breaking. "That mark doesn't come off. Once it's teared, it's yours." Elena blinked slowly, as if she heard but could no longer understand. Her lips parted, a whisper forming, though no sound followed. She lowered her gaze to the ribbon as though it had become the only truth left to her. Grace stepped forward, desperate, but in her chest she already knew the truth. The red ribbon was not a mistake, not a passing illusion. It had chosen, it had claimed. The stairwell door eased shut again, the pale face vanishing into the crack, the silence deepening until the only sound was the buzzing light overhead. But the weight did not lift. The cold did not fade. Elena lowered her arm slowly, her eyes dazed but steady now, as though some part of her had joined the silence below. Grace stared at her wrist, at the knot tied so perfectly, at the ribbon that refused to loosen. And in that moment, with a heaviness that settled into her bones, Grace understood. The girl in the stairwell had not been trying to come up. She had only been waiting for the next to be marked, the next to belong. Elena's wrist bore the ribbon now, and nothing Grace could do would change that. And now, the night has given you its tale. Maybe you'll carry it with you into dreams. Maybe it will wait until you wake, sitting quietly in the corner of the room. But remember this, the dark is patient. The whispers don't end when the story does. They linger. They watch. So close your eyes, if you dare, and sleep well, until the next night finds us again.